Chapter Roman 4 How to Use Victory. July 10, Unified Year 1925, Brest under Imperial military governance. Reporting in, Second Lieutenant Grants runs over and delivers the words the moment he arrives in a tone that is kept crisp out of a sense of duty despite the tension. First Lieutenant Weiss gathers from his expression that preparations are complete and promptly straightens up and faces him, feeling quite tense himself. Lieutenant Weiss, all battalion members are present. Thanks, Lieutenant Grants. Any logistical delays? None at all, sir. We're fully equipped with both provisions and gear. That meant everything was ready. It was such a significant report, but it went not to Major von de Guritschaf but the second in command of all people. He made his judgment upon receiving it. Considering how important the matter was, the commander herself should have made the call, but the senior officer at the moment was First Lieutenant Weiss. The duty and the tension of being in command above all, the immeasurable anxiety of assuming the position instead of Major von de Guritschaf, she told me I might be promoted before the year is out. The world is a strange place. Sir. It's nothing, Lieutenant. But now was no time to hesitate. This moment called for his decisive judgment as commander. He knew as an officer that throwing cold water on this strained, expectant mood would be an unforgivable error. What his duty required of him now was to carry out his responsibility. "Company leaders, report your status," he cried. Though he was endeavoring to maintain the composure of a pro, he couldn't hold back his anticipation entirely. All units present. Type 1 battle stations manned. In response to the roared order, a report of readiness. "What's your status?" The voice indicated the start of a battle was near. "Beer check, wine check." The response was proud. "Meat, fish check, check." Their extra rations were so generous that it seemed like the food and drink was challenging them to finish it off. The battalion's full fighting power was unsparingly committed to cleaning out all the items they'd swiped and stashed. Ocean check. And Weiss had unwavering confidence that he had chosen the right spot for it. "Great, troops, this operation is go." A clear water, blue sky, and the refreshing sunshine of early summer, the grills and cooking tables were equipped with mountains of many varieties of meat. Naturally, cases of bottled beer had been delivered by the cooler. There was even wine and champagne from who knew where. On this day, the elite majors of the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion were resolved to devote their bodies and souls to enjoying the beach. Everything had been for this day. To victory. To my brothers in arms. To the Reich, cheers, 3 toasts and a hearty shout. With that the men dropped all formalities for this day only. Beer drinking contests ensued. Champagne corks flew. Then shoulder to shoulder they all sang "We Are the Reich, Crown of the World." Their voices thundered from the pit of their stomachs to fill the Republican vacation spot. The beach was the best chance to sing uninterrupted odes to the sweet, ice-cold nectar of victory in their hands. To the Empire they cried and downed their beers. They would take full advantage of this opportunity to sing praises. Several soldiers took their shovels to the sand and began to play, never mind that they were grown men. Soon, platoons were pitted against one another in digging competitions. Others jumped straight into the water, while others still made a beeline for the grills with a shout of "First, the meat." Everyone there was right and truly intoxicated in victory, on the joy of surviving, and on the sense of accomplishment they got from carrying out their duty. At the same time, Imperial Army Brest Base. Reading the message her adjutant handed her, she rubs her temples and groans. Then, clinging to the overly optimistic hope that her conclusion will change upon a second reading, Magic Major Tanya von de Guritschaf of the Imperial Army, General Staff Officer, looks at it again. But it doesn't matter how far between the lines she reads. After all, it's clearly an official notice from the General Staff. "Sorry, Lieutenant Serebriakov, I'm going out for a moment." So with a word to her adjutant, Tanya puts her cap on in annoyance, slowly rises and heads for the residential building adjacent to Battalion HQ. Looking up, she sees fair skies in contrast with her mood. It's almost summer, It isn't too hot yet, but summer is probably near. Tanya was the one who cleared First Lieutenant Weiss and the others to take leave and go on vacation. It was also she who approved expenses from the battalion's coffers as a recognition of her subordinates' services, for them to spend a day having a barbecue at the beach. That's well, it's fine. They are just officers serving in the field. It's only natural that they should have the right to taste the sweet nectar of victory. And Tanya is not at all averse to respecting the rights of others. She knows it's unforgivable for a superior to take advantage of their subordinates simply because they are subordinate and infringe on their rights. So Tanya doesn't blame the troops for celebrating their victory. It's fine, they gave their all from the positions they were in. The problem, laments Tanya, just barely holding back her hellish rage and looking to the heavens, is that the same optimism has tainted the brass. It's hopeless. Her pent-up anger and distrust completely exploded with this congratulatory message from the General Staff. A personal congrats would be one thing, but this was an official statement from the General Staff, of all people, aimed at the entire army and naively praising our great victory, of all things. The moment she understood, she had a hard time reining in her emotions. With her scant remaining self-control, she avoided a total explosion on the spot, but she was literally seething with anger. The moment she closes the door, she hurls her cap to the floor and screams her true feelings. Shit, the sweet nectar of victory. We missed our chance to end this war. You may know how to win, but you don't understand how to use it. With the cool-headed corner of her mind, Tanya understands that telling everyone to piss off is pointless. That's why she has enough sense to get it all out in her room where she doesn't have to worry about anyone overhearing. But once she is in her room, she can't hold it back. How stupid must the General Staff be to get so giddy over this great victory when the war isn't even over yet? What are they thinking? She curses them as the urge takes her. This can't be possible. Why isn't the General Staff putting this victory to good use? Why, Supreme High Command isn't even doing negotiations. Are they not interested in ending the war? A war is broken into multiple stages. Yes, the officers and men carried out their duty fine as far as the front lines. They were able to contribute to this great victory. As such, they should be allowed to celebrate. They have that right. But if the General Staff meant to be directing the war and the organization above it, Supreme High Command, are getting all excited about winning and breaking into the celebratory whine, that's negligence, that's a mistake. No, more than that, it's evil, it's a criminal lack of action. Shit, why is this happening? How did the General Staff suddenly get so? How did they suddenly get so dim-witted? In any case, practically pulling her hair out over this mess, Tanya turns on the alcohol burner in her room to boil some water and reaches for her mill. She carefully grinds the fine Arabica coffee beans she acquired immediately after the capture of Parasii and readies a drip filter. Then, with the water at the right temperature, she lets the bloom form on top of the grounds before meticulously pouring and transferring the results into a mug. Finally, she takes a deep breath, seeking peace of mind in the fragrance, and relaxes. The General Staff doesn't understand the situation, but why is that? Her question is genuine. Why did this happen? The Imperial Army is a bunch of sticklers for efficiency who make sure even lower-ranking officers are well versed in planning and drafting operations. At the War College, they hammered in how to not only cope with encounters under unknown circumstances and make snap decisions, but also plan as far as possible to minimize the fog of war, among other things. I just can't understand it. What happened? Which is why, having regained composure, albeit temporarily, Tanya cannot fathom why the General Staff is so high on victory. The General Staff was supposedly of particularly rational officers, even considering the makeup of the Imperial Army at large. Probability theory doesn't seem to allow that every last one of them would lose their minds at the same time. How is it then that they are all wasted on the wine of victory? Yeth, I really just don't get this change in the higher-ups. Ugh, well, a picture is worth 1,000 words. I guess I have no choice but to go over there in person. So she makes up her mind as she finishes off her coffee. There is nothing for her to do but go ask them herself. Luckily, the battalion is not currently on rapid response standby. It's not ideal for a commander to leave their unit, but no one should object to her visiting the general staff for a few days. In that case, thinks Tanya, time is a finite resource, so I can't waste it. Once she decides on a course of action, all that's left is to promptly act. She picks up the internal communications device in the corner of her room and calls up Battalion HQ. Duty Officer 2nd Lieutenant Serebriakov speaking. Lieutenant, it's me. Oh, Major, what can I do for you? With a slight sense of satisfaction that Serebriakov was quick enough to pick up in 2 rings, Tanya briefly states her business. I'm going to pop in on the general staff. While I get permission from HQ, please prepare our bag size, mine and yours, and get word to Lieutenant Weiss. Understood. I believe he's currently on leave, but I'll let him know. Shall I reserve long-distance railway tickets? Oh, if he can't come here, you can just radio him, and we don't need tickets. I'm getting authorization to fly straight to the General Staff Office. Do, however, secure accommodations for us in the capital. Time is short, so we don't have the leisure to take it easy in a train. Tanya has already decided on cutting across the former Rhine lines and flying in directly. Luckily, perhaps it can be said, Type 97s will allow them to get to the capital with plenty of energy remaining. Regardless of how it would go if it were a combat flight, simply passing through friendly airspace should be plenty doable. Understood, Major. How many days will you spend in the capital? Not many, but 3 for certain. She knows she has to take General von Zetter's schedule into consideration, so she's already resigned to the fact that this will be a time-consuming endeavor, and figures it's best to overestimate the length of her stay. Of course, really, she doesn't want to be away from her post for long, but she's already decided that she'll wage a fierce battle of words in the capital if necessary. Understood. Right away. Ma'am, all right then. Tanya gets her things together and packs her Type I dress uniform. Then she turns in 2 flight plan approval forms, one for her and one for Serebriakov, as well as a plan assuming a direct flight, and receives authorization almost immediately. Meanwhile, Visha had received the orders and was making her preparations for their trip to the capital just as briskly, not about to let Tanya outdo her. She contacted the Magic Officers Club and reserved 2 rooms. Then, using her status as the adjutant of the commander of a battalion reporting directly to the General Staff, she secured the use of one official car from the General Staff's rear section. Times like these it really hit her. The 203rd really gets a lot of respect for being directly under the General Staff. Usually the higher-ups hate doing anything over the phone where they can't see your face, but even a young officer like me calls and the staff in the rear generously consents. So instead of the beach I'm on leave in the capital, well, it's not so bad. Maybe I'll get to see some old faces. Which is why, for just a moment, she thought maybe she should be able to enjoy her vacation as well. If I can make time, maybe I'll be able to talk to friends in person instead of updating them in letters. Of course, she would only do that after quickly accomplishing the things she needed to do. So Visha proceeded to take care of those tasks in an orderly way. Lodgings were arranged, transportation was locked down. The report for the incoming duty officer she put with the battalion logbook and the report of her activities. Lieutenant Weiss would be able to glean all he needed to from a single read-through. Major von de Guritschaf told her that she understood Lieutenant Weiss was on break, so all Visha had to do was contact him and her part was done. Excuse me, this is 2nd Lieutenant Serebriakov. May I speak with 1st Lieutenant Weiss? Okay. She called the vacation facility number she was given just in case via long-distance telephone and asked for Lieutenant Weiss. This is 1st Lieutenant Weiss. Lieutenant, this is 2nd Lieutenant Serebriakov. So sorry to call you while you're on leave. And because he was on vacation, Visha had intended to say only the minimum. Please contact the Major. Oh, Visha, are you calling to cry to me that you wish you were at the beach too? We're having a grand old time. Yes, it was unexpected. Usually Lieutenant Weiss was more composed and thoughtful, but this time he was drunk and slipped up, and what he said made Visha just a little bit mad. Up until that moment, her thoughts on the matter had been, well, of course I'd like to go with everyone, but if the second in command is out and my superior, the major, is staying behind, then as her adjutant I have to serve as duty officer. But things didn't play out that way. No, I have a message for you. The major has some business at the General Staff Office, so we're leaving for 3 or 4 days. So Visha was true to her miffed feelings. Taking advantage of his slip, she matter-of-factly stated the truth. So you're letting me know so I can take over? Yes, I was to inform you. That was everything Major von de Guritschaf had told her. We're going to the capital, so contact Lieutenant Weiss to let him know. Since that was her assigned duty, she was telling the truth. I guess now that you told me that I should go back and talk to the major, as you like. I've delivered the necessary message, so I don't presume to have anything else to say on the matter. Sadly, that was the unadorned truth. Sticking her tongue out in her mind, Visha took a bit of revenge. The major had told her not to force him to come. Put another way, she didn't say clearly to have him come or not come, and guessing what she meant was not part of Visha's job. Of course, given their superior's utilitarian mindset, Visha personally felt that over the phone was good enough. But she had no obligation to say as much to him. Got it, Lieutenant. Yeah, I should talk to the major directly about this. Okay, Lieutenant Grants, the rest is up to you. As for me, I've received an invitation from a beautiful lady. So when Lieutenant Weiss, seeming to have decided on his own what needed to be done, left everything else to Lieutenant Grants in a voice more cheerful than he ever used, Visha couldn't help but laugh. Yes, sir, Lieutenant, don't worry about a thing. Every last one of us will stand our ground against this formidable enemy and fight through. Then, imagining the scene on the other end of the line, something occurred to Visha. Lieutenant Weiss is probably actually drunk and not thinking up to his usual speed. Or shit, I'm so lucky to have a report like you. Lieutenant, if you're going to meet a lady, I'd sober up first. Hey, you all better have hangovers tomorrow. Having left them with that, he grabbed a ride to the base and sobered up on the way. When he arrived, he changed out of his civilian clothing and promptly went to Battalion HQ. If his superior was going to the General Staff Office now, maybe something was happening. If anything, it could be related to her attempt to act independently that nearly violated the ceasefire. The possibility might have caused him to overthink it. Hoping his breath didn't stink of booze, he entered the room and announced himself. First Lieutenant Weiss reporting in. The first thing he saw was Major von de Guritschaf and Lieutenant Serebriakov with their flying goggles on and their luggage ready. Oh, Lieutenant, good timing. The situation is a bit of a mess. It seems like the staffers are so excited they are not even thinking about how to end the war. There's nothing else I can do but go over there personally. It'll only be a few days, but take care of things here while I'm gone. Understood. He would be in charge while she was away. That was exactly the same as what he had already heard on the phone. So now she must have something important to tell me. He braced himself and devoted his entire being to hearing the words she would say next. I did call you, but I knew you were on your vacation. I didn't think you'd come all the way here when a phone call would have sufficed. You were probably thinking of me, but I'm sorry I interrupted your party, Lieutenant. For a moment, his superior's nonchalant tone had Weiss at a loss. He had been convinced there would be something important he would need to hear in person, but it turned out she was simply getting in touch about being away. And that was when he finally realized he'd been putting in way too much effort and running around for no reason. Oh, no. It's no big deal. He was confused until he carefully remembered the earlier conversation and realized just what as you like meant when he had asked if he should return or not. What is it, Lieutenant Serebriakov? Oh, I'm just impressed by Lieutenant Weiss' kindness and attention to detail. After all, Major von de Guritschaf wasn't the type of officer to give vague directions. Weiss should have understood the moment Serebriakov said, as you like. He regretted being under the influence while receiving a message. If his head had been clear, he probably would have been able to catch Serebriakov's drift, even over the phone. Well, I was on vacation, but I guess I should be ready to be called up at any time, even on leave, he thought, and then added, I probably shouldn't have made that remark either. Well, the unfortunate truth was that for Weiss and other imperial soldiers, wartime leave usually amounted to medical treatment in the rear or being off duty in the trenches, so he had been enjoying his first real vacation. Yes, he's a model communicator. Well be off, take it easy while I'm gone. Drilling just enough to maintain discipline is fine. Understood, have a safe trip, Major. Will do, thanks and sorry again. Hello, I'm Major von de Guritschaf. Please get me General von Zetua, it's urgent. Oh, Major, I'm terribly sorry, but the General is currently out. That doesn't happen very often, thinks Tanya, but she figures if he's busy with military affairs, it can't be helped. She adjusts her expectations and tries again. Then, sorry, may I see General von Rudersdorf? She says it simply, expecting to just see General von Zetua's friend first, but she gathers immediately from the troubled look on the staffer's face that this request is also impossible. She asks with her eyes what it could possibly mean. You'll have to excuse me, Major von de Guritschaf, but well, everyone from the General Staff Office is out. Tanya had braced herself for some reluctance to reply, but the duty officer revealed the issue with unexpected readiness. I see, and where might they be? But actually the answer came so readily that all she feels is a sense that something is amiss. After all, she's certain that the General Staff officers are terribly busy at all times. And she knows from experience that she can drop in unannounced if something is critical and get them to look at it. That adaptability, that flexibility, is the Imperial Army General Staff's strength, and it only works because of the close contact between the officers directing the operations. Which is why Tanya can't believe it. Even when she is informed that the office is practically empty, she doesn't quite get it. So compelled by necessity, she comes up with a reason. For example, maybe their attendance was required at some big function at court. Or maybe they had to show up for some occasion, a party or whatnot. That is her naive expectation. That straight-laced bunch would never leave the General Staff Office empty at such a critical juncture for no reason. I think they are at the beer hall. The beer hall, which is why all she can do at that moment is parrot the words back at the duty officer. What did he just say to me? Beer hall, what's a beer hall? Beer hall, it's a place for drinking alcohol, so what need can there possibly be for the entire General Staff to go there all at once? Yes, they were shouting about drinking to celebrate our victory. I wanted to go too, but you know how it is. Yes, thanks for your service. If you'll excuse me then. Hearing this reply, she is forced to devote nearly her entire being to maintaining her blank expression and nodding. All right, Major, good night. After receiving an easygoing send-off from the duty officer, Tanya burrows grimly into bed. The next day, the staff officers, having drunk like fish for the first time in quite a while, are also nursing their first hangovers. It's been so long it's almost nostalgic competing to see who can feign normalcy most skillfully, until into the General Staff Office marches the fierce Major Tanya von de Guritschaf. General, excuse me, but... She has resolved to speak directly to General von Zetua at the center of the General Staff and find out the whole story. Oh, Major, I heard about the fleet, and the base commander's gripes, but my conclusion is that both of you erred in the course of your duties. But what the hell is this now, as long as you are both correct? It's only a matter of reprimanding the pair of you to exercise more self-control. That said, Major, it seems you went a bit far this time. The answer she has given misses the mark so completely she finds herself glaring at him despite realizing it's rude. What the hell is wrong with all my superior officers? What? Don't worry, Major. But he continues to astound her. We beat the pants off them. No one's going to get upset at you now that the end of the war is near. But she freezes at the sound of the end of the war. Those words can cause so much damage. Apparently Tanya is the only one who knows it won't happen. Then, having trouble holding her expression steady, she averts her eyes to the window and realizes she was wrong. The staffers going to and fro in the office look so ecstatic. catching them out of the corner of her eye. She's racked with grief. Thea all so excited about the great victory. Thea all savouring the taste of their triumph on the Rhine front and the capture of Parisii. Swept up in a euphoria, they are living in a moment so happy they went to the beer hall to let themselves go for once. It dawns on Tanya. Major General von Zetua is an outstanding officer on both the political and military fronts. On top of that, he's a pragmatist who sees things objectively, and when necessary, as numbers or statistics. Even he is drunk on sweet victory. Probably he convinced himself of the victory with his logical prowess. He probably thought that any further fighting would not only be useless to the Republic but harmful. And if waging war no longer benefited them, then the war would surely end. General von Zetua must not understand that the Republicans will continue to resist with no regard for odds, rationale, or profit and loss. But in the next moment, Tanya wonders objectively if maybe she has only lost hope because she knows the outcome of being Dunkirked. The remnants they let escape are seeds of resistance, so to speak. Some will fail. Some can be stamped out under the Imperial Army's boots, while others can be plucked out by Air Force attacks. Many of them won't have the moisture of the people and will thus dry out completely, unable to produce a resistance bud. But if those seeds are sown in the soft soil of a colony, eventually they will bear fruit capable of launching a counteroffensive. That is a real threat. But even with that in mind, objectively speaking, the current situation is one of great victory. Anyone would agree that the Empire won. Despite the Commonwealth's intervention and ultimatum, the Empire performed this amazing feat in no time. The Republic was slain in the blink of an eye, the Entente alliance is being brought under imperial military government, and the governance of Dasha is proceeding apace. The world can only watch transfixed. The Empire's victory, its glory, is genuine in this moment. That's why, thinks Tanya darkly, seeing the point of divergence between the truth that she knows and the conclusion reached by logic in reality. The attitude she's getting from General von Zetua that, thinking rationally, this is where we end the Weris correct. After all, the Empire succeeded in annihilating the Republican main forces. It's a triumph that will surely be remembered in military history. The Empire achieved an overwhelming victory in the field and has only a very few things to worry about. Victory, oh how spellbinding you are. The Empire has earned the right to be drunk on your sweet wine. I'm relieved to hear that, sir. I only hope there will be a chance to make up for the trouble I caused. That's fine, then to victory, to victory. She suppresses her emotions with sheer self-restraint, exchanges salutes and maintains proper manners as she exits the room. But even magic Major Tanya von de Guritschaf is human. So when Lieutenant Colonel von Lergen passes by her on his way to get General von Zetua's approval on some documents, he notices that her expression is more warped than he has ever seen it before. Excuse me, so did something happen? Major von de Guritschaf had a strange look on her face just now. He hesitates to say it looked like a tearful grimace befitting a girl of her age. After all, the dark expression belonged to Major von de Guritschaf. That could be worth worrying about. Oh, Colonel von Lergen, what do you mean strange? Well, it just seemed to me that for a moment she looked awfully grim. Oh no, perhaps she had some advice for me. So Zetua would never learn the truth that she looked like she was about to cry from hopelessness. Though he sensed that something had been left unsaid, even Zetua didn't intuit that she gave up in resignation. Shall I call her back? No, I'll talk to her the next chance I get. He decides to wait for her to come to him again and turns to the countless papers he needs to approve. After all, he is the deputy director of the service corps, so he has a mountain of important work to do. At that time, everyone had faith. The war would end and the Empire had won. But it wasn't a future they were glad to welcome, which was why various countries, the Commonwealth at the forefront, roared that they would resist to the last in order to avoid that nightmare. The remnants of the Republican army that escaped from the mainland joined the remnants of the Entente Alliance army, and together they based themselves in the Republic's overseas colonial holdings and declared that they would continue the war against the empire. They called themselves the Free Republic, and their opposition was already posing a challenge to the military government the imperial army was establishing on the mainland. And near Mary Sue, people were both hostile toward and frightened by the empire. She was being raised among people who had escaped the Entente alliance to hope for peace from a safe place. To the majority of the refugees, the fact that even the Republic had dropped out of the fight was a huge disappointment. They had anticipated the fall of the empire. That was why they were so happy to see the Republic's offensive. So when they saw the deadlock, they tasted despair, and everyone was shocked to witness the collapse of the Republican army. Can no one seal away the evil of the empire? But they couldn't accept that. So the refugees immediately rejected their own weak-willed doubts. That can't be. Believing that justice wouldn't overlook this wrong, they hoped and prayed. Many refugees joined their voices and protested further expansion of the horrible empire. Well, fight, too. Inspired or perhaps intoxicated by that cheer, people began to volunteer for the army. And touched by their passion, the countries began accepting them. And it wasn't just the refugees. Young people of each nation raised their voices in a frenzy. We must join the Commonwealth Army confronting the empire and fight. At the same time, newspapers began to print editorials cautioning against the birth of an empire too large, complete with expert comments, and even in the unified states, some sounded warning bells that they were not so terribly removed from the situation on the continent. Everyone, whether they wanted to or not, had to understand that a period of violent upheaval in the balance of power had arrived. The tone of the debate stemming from that anxiety eventually began to naturally turn to exhorting countries to prepare, for their own safety, against the empire. Hence, everyone's heartfelt cheers for the remaining troops of the Republican Army, who reassuringly declared they would continue to resist the empire as the Free Republican Army. The Commonwealth had also declared that they would resist the empire to the last, and everyone expected much from its new Prime Minister, the Duke of Marlborough, and his war leadership. Likewise, they felt they should fight under said leadership and began to join forces. She had power. That is, she had magic abilities she inherited from her father, Anson, and they were a gift that put her in a league of her own. If there hadn't been a war, her talent wouldn't have been much use to her, so perhaps it would have remained hidden. In fact, Anson had always explained to his family that just because they had the aptitude, that didn't mean they had to become mages. Mary could still remember the kind voice of her father telling her not to limit her options. He had encouraged her to walk her own path and always said he would support whatever future she chose. That was precisely why she was so determined. Meanwhile, the empire was reluctantly coming to terms with continuation of the war and readying itself to claim another great victory. However, perhaps it should be said, unlike with the other countries the empire had fought, the army couldn't avoid crossing a sea to do battle with the Commonwealth. Of course, this was the empire that had cut off the Entente alliance's supply lines by conducting a landing operation in the enemy's rear territory. So it wasn't as if the option of an amphibious operation wasn't on the table. But as always, that entailed a caveat, as long as it could secure command of the sea. And when asked about the prospects of securing command of the sea, Fleet Command only answered that it might be possible if they risked annihilation. So the Empire was facing a serious dilemma. If it engaged in a naval battle, maybe it could eliminate or check the Commonwealth's resistance for just long enough to get troops onto the mainland. But if the Empire's fleet got wiped out, it wouldn't have the wherewithal to take on another naval battle. At that point, no matter how many units landed, it would mean nothing because their supplies would be cut off, and they would be annihilated just like the Republican main forces were. That said, leaving the Commonwealth mainland alone would be tantamount to ignoring the enemy's powerful strategic base. Of course, the Commonwealth Army had a limited number of soldiers, so it wasn't a terribly worrisome direct threat, But at the rate things were going, it would be an endless draw. Chapter V. Internal Affairs. A certain dimension, a certain domain of existence. The being there trembled with joy. Wonderful. He was so happy he nearly praised the glory of the Lord in spite of himself. No, he did. To solemnly praise the Almighty Being, he raised a pious face to the heavens and shouted Hallelujah. Of course, no one in this place would reproach him for such an act. Rather, they would join in. After all, they were creatures of that being as intelligent as the spaghetti monster. 8. Cherub sir, did something happen? Oh, Archangel, keep up the good work. I'm just so happy that faith has been growing by leaps and bounds lately. Having finished his exulting prayer, he responded to the address with a smile and praised the Homo sapiens' return to the life and death cycle. What wonderful news, the cherub's manner all but proclaimed, expressing his relief that order had finally been restored. These beings were charged with leading the creatures known as Homo sapiens, guiding their souls, and this was the first positive report they had received in quite a while. And it was only natural that the Archangel, upon hearing it, would smile and express his approval. Naturally, he celebrated that things were as they should be. It was a hymn for the Great One, nearly overflowing from his heart and very being. O God, Creator, you are great, that is very good indeed, but that's strange, hold on. Yet doubt appeared on the Archangel's fine features. Restored faith and a promised return to the cycle of life and death was wonderful. If their appeals to the people had been effective, then eventually they would be able to guide their souls. But something suddenly confused the Archangel. He had the feeling that only a short time ago he had heard something different. They were all equal before the One in all, and outside the hierarchy of their obligations rather tolerant. Thus it was permissible for him to second-guess the words of a superior being, which is why, perhaps it should be said, as long as the Archangel was engaged in holy work, he had an obligation to ask the cherub anything he didn't understand. Is something wrong? And the cherub was obliged to answer. For them, delays in holy duties were unforgivable, so any and all obstacles had to be overcome. Naturally, the cherub politely responded with good intentions, his voice soft. To him it was proper to work together in the fight for the glory of the Lord. Both of them only meant well. I hear evil atheists have infested their world. That was why they had to stand up and bravely confront evil. It was their sacred duty. What? Nothing like that is happening in my jurisdiction. Do you know whose it is? But the Archangel had raised an issue the cherub hadn't heard of. In his area, the people were definitely beginning to sense the presence of God. Yes, they all clung piously to his voice, acted as was right for his creatures to act, and fervently wished for the Almighty Father's grace. To the cherub, protecting and guiding humble believers was a delight. Nothing made him happier. No, it was his raison d'etre. He was created for no other purpose but this, which was why he smiled happily. These beings had transcended the loathsome habit of sectionalism, but paradoxically, the news that the horrible, well-meaning evil of atheism had filled the little lambs they were meant to protect and guide pained his heart to the point of bursting. Just hearing that atheists were running rampant cast a shadow across his beautiful face. For such a thing to happen in one's jurisdiction was a great sorrow indeed. Therefore, out of utter kindness and a sense of duty, he had to ask, if such terrible tragedy was occurring, I'd like to do anything I can to assist. Does anyone know whose jurisdiction it is? He felt he had to extend a helping hand. Alas, I'm ashamed to admit it is my own. Naturally, rather than conceal this awkward problem, it was better to solve it together. After all, that was their job as guides. No, it was their holy duty as creations of the Lord. If they couldn't lead the lost lambs properly, how could they claim to be guides? Ushering lost lambs down the path of righteousness with joy, to be as they were meant to be, was their raison d'etre. Anyone who neglected it could only be seen as a fallen, evil being beyond all saving. So an offer of aid on the path of salvation was always welcome. That said, while these things sometimes happened, the unspoken expectation was that it was relatively inexperienced beings themselves, liable to stray, who would fail in their guidance, which was why all the beings present were shocked to hear that their supervisor wasn't sure how to proceed with his guidance. "The ones under your guidance, Sir Seraph, how could such a thing have come to pass? The seraphim served the Father most closely of all, yet this one's guidance wasn't reaching the people, the guidance of this truly faithful seraph who was trusted just as deeply by God the Father. If a seraph wasn't enough to save them, then it really was a puzzle." Yes, lamentably, the fools have not only abandoned their faith, they even, if you can believe it, blaspheme. Blasphemy, how could it be? Rather than understanding the sheep, the beings could be described as basically unconcerned. Only rarely did something occur to cause a change in their attitude, but this was even rarer than that was that shocking. They were up against mass atheism. Not only that, but reports indicated that behavior judged blasphemous was happening on the same scale. They were committing the sin of holy sacrilege. But if that was true, why would it spread to them all? Those were the questions on their uncomprehending minds. It shouldn't be possible. I heard there is even an outrageous movement to deify their rulers. But the seraph spat the reply as if saying it disgusted him and removed all doubt from their minds. For a moment all were silent. A beat later, the meaning of what he had said sunk in and astonishment followed. Have they really so little fear? What sort of person would you have to be to do such things? It's revolting to even say, but apparently they lump God in with opium. He provided the explanation reluctantly. How could the origin of the world be equated to something so unclean? There were even some recalcitrants aiming to replace God the Father. Even the beings who fell in the past hadn't come up with something so awful. That was why it was so unsettling. They were simply stunned. What, is there no limit to the horror? That was more or less how they all felt. There was one thought that didn't get voiced. How could this have happened? This just isn't going very well, is it? The cherub lamented with a sigh in spite of himself, but it was likewise the unmistakable sentiment of all present. His overflowing joy of a moment ago had been replaced with sadness, as if it had never been. But half the world is still filled with pious little lambs seeking salvation. They had finally managed to bring the voice of God to the believers. During the war, the humans had finally begun to seek salvation from a transcendental being. I can't believe the other half have fallen to the wickedness of atheism. That half the world should have fallen into darkness where the good news wouldn't reach. With all due respect, I find that hard to believe. They've received the good news. How could half the world have descended into the primitive darkness of atheism or what have you? Is that really possible? At the same time, the archangel and other angels sighed their doubts. They questioned whether it could really be possible. They agonized over whether it could really become a majority. It was truly unthinkable. No, they were in denial of the impossible phenomenon. For something like that should never happen to a group who had been given the good news. Perhaps it could happen to a single person. There were examples in Homo sapiens' history of individuals being seized by such insanity. Their policy on those isolated examples was to de-emphasize them. Though they were interested in humans as a group, they were nearly indifferent to them as individuals. But a group who had received the good news descending into such darkness was worrisome indeed. It was virtually unheard of. If they searched the past, they could find examples of new forms of faith or reduced faith, so they had experience dealing with such problems. But this had never happened before, and neither had they anticipated it. It certainly is strange. Good grief, what came over them? That said, they couldn't simply weep and fail to act. They were tirelessly faithful to their duties, and as such they scraped together all their wisdom. If we want to restore faith, what about sending in that one? The glory of being God's servant is too great a responsibility for just one, and a human at that. I see, yes, it might be too harsh to simply say, no, God's will. In the past, Homo sapiens only managed it after we told them several times and they finally listened. Then how about continuing to call out to them? No, we can't save them that way. Leaving faithless souls to wander would go against God's will. The conclusion they reached out of their utter goodwill was to go with their usual way of restoring faith. Then wouldn't the best way be to teach Homo sapiens of his grace through trials? As for the vital how, the cherub suggested a method through which he had had some success, and the others accepted. I see. If we give that one the glory of fighting as a servant of God, we can expect a conversion. After all, though they were generally indifferent to individuals, they were already keeping an eye on one of them. Since faith had already been growing as a result, it was more than worth trying in this case as well. Please wait. The glory of fighting as God's servant shouldn't be reserved for a single individual. Enlightenment is important, but I think it's vital to respond to the prayers of the deeply faithful as well. And they had good intentions. The suggestion of having that one fight for the grace of God was made with utterly good intentions. We must convert the lamb who forgot the light of God's protection and glory, and we must save those who pray. Then let's do that. How about specifics? Everyone welcomed the opinion. They were saviors. The protests of an individual meant to deliver his grace were meaningless to them. No, since no one had the ears to hear them, no one would point out they should listen. Well, if anything, perhaps it was a difference of perspective. Even humans are virtually incapable of listening to non-human opinions. Shall we ask the throne? All right, I will mention it to the Lord. Thus it was decided without a single objection. August 22, Unified Year 1925. It was 2 months after the fall of the mainland republic. At the time, suffice it to say that everyone living in the empire believed that the war was over. After all, the empire had defeated the neighbouring Entente alliance, the Republic, and incidentally the Principality. The boast "we are the Reich, crown of the world" had begun to have a ring of truth to it. Even the news that the Commonwealth had joined in on the side of the Republic wasn't enough to dampen the euphoria. With no major fighting or naval battles, no one expected the Commonwealth to be an obstacle to the restoration of peace. Everyone murmured as if they knew. They joined the battle far too late. So when it was reported that the Commonwealth had rejected the Empire's invitation to a peace conference, the public sentiment in the Empire was mainly confusion. They couldn't understand what made the war so enjoyable that the Commonwealth was itching to continue it. Of course, people in the Empire were aware that the Free Republican Army, made up of Republican troops who howled that they would resist to the end, was putting up a meagre fight in some Republican colonies. More importantly, it was also reported that the Commonwealth and its kingdoms, having decided to intervene in this war, were cooperating with the Free Republican Army. But even knowing all that, everyone had to wonder, why are they so interested in continuing the war? The outcome had already been decided on the battlefield. The Imperial Army had literally wiped out the Entente Alliance Army, the Principality's army, and the Republican Army, and its power as the conqueror was known far and wide. And while the Empire's terms were harsh, the people believed it was fundamentally a treaty that could restore peace, so the resistance of the obstinate Republican remnants and the stubborn Commonwealth was irritating at first, then anger-inducing. Why do they want to continue the war? Eventually they realized something. Weren't they the ones that started the war? That was no small matter. No, it was the open truth, which was why in the Empire, the psychological foundation had been laid from the beginning. They believed those remnants, the enemy, hoped to continue the war, hence their own hopes. Well, bring the iron hammer down on those who dare harm the Reich. May the evil enemy be struck from this world. So the fanatical cry of "smite the enemy" spread. No one questioned their belief in the righteousness of their own country and justice, which was why they couldn't understand. The Empire failed to comprehend the fear the other countries had, the fundamental fear that an immensely powerful state, an unrivaled hegemon, would be established in the center of the continent. Additionally, due to the manner in which the Empire had been founded, it had always had multiple conflict zones. The conflicts stemmed from incompatible views. To the Empire, those places were unquestionably imperial territory, while to the surrounding countries the land had been stolen from them. Ultimately, that was why the Republic worked with the other powers to encircle the Empire using exterior line strategy. and why the empire developed its interior lines strategy to break through that encirclement. Then, finally, the empire was overjoyed to have eliminated all the threats to its security. But to the other parties, it looked like a grave threat to their security that couldn't be ignored. Sadly, the empire was so busy showing off the sharpness of its sword that it didn't notice how much it frightened everyone. Then nationalism and mutual distrust fanned the flames. Of course, everyone wished for peace. Yes, earnestly. Which was why, for the sake of peace and protecting everyone, they took up their guns and fought. Other countries with their own agendas added their support. In this ironic way, the wish for peace didn't cause the war to abate but only escalated it. The same day, the Unified States. In one room of the recruitment office, the major, introduced as both the occupant of the office and the head of the department in charge of conscription, spoke honestly as he somewhat awkwardly offered Mary a seat. "Miss Mary Sue, we're very happy to receive your application." His voice was calm, and he looked her straight in the eye. But the Unified States views dual citizenship as an extremely complicated issue, especially given the citizenship laws in the Entente Alliance. Volunteering for the Unified States Army could ultimately harm your status there. So I have to warn you that despite your youth, it's very likely you'll need to make a choice regarding your nationality. He continued politely, saying he didn't mean to press her for the difficult decision, but still respecting her will. The kind people of the Unified States were always so considerate like that. Everyone said the same friendly things to the Entente Alliance refugee kids. "We're glad you want to help, but you don't need to worry about that right now. Don't your grandmother, your mother and I's, even your deceased father want you to stay safe here out of harm's way? Isn't everyone worried about you?" "Yes, but that's exactly why I want to do what I can to protect this peace. I think I can help." So Mary explained earnestly in her own words why she was volunteering. "I think there must be something I can do." She appealed to the major to let her do what she could for the Unified States and for peace. "Well, you do have a point. The Unified States Army is currently recruiting voluntary units that will be sent to our ally, the Commonwealth. That's one way, as you mentioned, to protect this peace. But there are many other helpful, necessary tasks young people can undertake inside the Unified States." The call had gone out regarding the Unified States Volunteer Expeditionary Forces to be deployed to the Commonwealth. It was said these troops would, as a rule, not intervene in combat actions, but be stationed in the Commonwealth. The troops were nominally being deployed in connection with patrols to guarantee free passage and civilian rights, according to the law of war. But everyone read the move as a turning point, the Unified States' first decisive step, which was why Mary reacted immediately. She raced down to the nearest office to turn in her application, only to be kindly told it's too soon as usual. "You mean as a good citizen of the Unified States?" "Exactly. Children should be protected. Our situation isn't so dire that we have to send them off to war. Actually, you're only just old enough to volunteer. It won't be too late if you take some time to make your decision, you know. Wouldn't you like to try being a good citizen?" he asked. The Unified States was generous enough to interpret the law flexibly and grant dual citizenship to refugees from the Entente Alliance who had close relatives who were already residents. In that way, by offering the refugees a quiet life and a little peace, it made a place for them. Mary understood that the reason they didn't want to send the youth to war, as he explained to her again, was that they hoped the ones they had taken in would be safe. But Mary could volunteer. The citizenship she had been granted and her ability as a mage qualified her. So she had already considered her position and arrived at her decision. "I know. I thought it all over, but sure enough, I'd like to volunteer." The flag on display in the center of the room was not the flag of her fatherland, but of the Unified States. To Mary, it wasn't the flag of her home. It was different from the Entente Alliance flag the mother and father she loved and respected had displayed in their house. Butite was the flag of their second home, the country that was kind enough to take them in. If my grandmother and mother, the family I must protect, are here, if there is something I can do to help stop the war. Miss Mary Sue, if you go to battle you might get injured, you could die, you might upset your grandmother and mother. I do feel bad about that, but I would regret not doing what I could have even more. She had worried about that. It was the only thing she had worried about, but compelled by her inner drive to do something, she could state positively that may be so, but there's something I've got to do. Are you sure? Yes, I've decided to volunteer. In her mind, she thought of her home country and the people's backs as they prayed at the church. Grief, sadness, and a wish for peace, she would give her whole self for those things if it would make a difference. For God, for their families, and for themselves, they would do what they could. All right, then you need to make an oath to the flag. Do you remember how it goes? Yes, I memorized it. Seems like you're quite determined. Once you volunteer, you must do whatever your military duties require of you, do you understand? The major pushed his point in what could be called his final confirmation. Because Mary understood that he was hoping she would change her mind, she replied too quickly, leaving no room for objections. Of course. I'll make the oath. Standing, she raised a hand and swore. She pledged herself to the unified states. I pledge allegiance. It was one girl, Mary Sue's contract with the unified states. Power had to be wielded with justice, so she would do what she could. To the unified states and its countrymen, one nation under God, indivisible. She would use all of her strength for the family she had to protect, for the people, and to carry out God's justice, and to defend its republic, to create a world in which she would never again have to experience the sadness of losing family to the empire. In the name of liberty and justice, she swore with her own sense of justice that she believed in. May God protect you. Dear God, please, oh please, protect us. Thus, with a sincere prayer, Mary Sue enlisted and was assigned with the other volunteer majors to the Unified States Free Entente Alliance 1st Mage Regiment. August 24, Unified Year 1925, Imperial Army General Staff Office, Dining Room 1. The cafeteria at the General Staff Office made a rule for itself that the meals it served must be equal or inferior in quality to those of the mobilized soldiers in the field. Due to the prevalence of that touching rumor around the empire, Dining Room 1 was deserted as usual. The only ones to appear at the cafeteria were those required by unavoidable circumstances to eat there. The people thus in the predicament of reluctantly sipping the awful pseudo coffee were stuck washing down their complaints about its quality with either tasteless water or said pseudo coffee. I suppose it's a reward for the victory. You and I have been promoted. Congratulations, Lieutenant General von Zetua. Thanks, Lieutenant General von Rudestorff. Now let's get back to business. Indeed. This isn't the place for a celebration in any case, and so the awful ersatz coffee put a damper on the pair's celebration of their respective promotions to Lieutenant General. When Zetua made the practical suggestion of getting back to business, Rudestorff didn't feel the atmosphere was right for a celebration either. That was the General Staff Office cafeteria in a nutshell. All right then. So Rudestorff flatly changed gears and brought up the pending issue before them, the next stage of their operations. Though the Republican army on the mainland was completely under control, remnants of the forces calling themselves the Free Republican Army were holding out in the Republic's colonies. The Commonwealth had joined the fight, and the Imperial High Seas Fleet was facing its navy, but unfortunately there was still quite a large gap between the two in terms of strength. Even if the Empire sent its entire fleet, it would only amount to half the size of the Commonwealth's. Though the public and some of Supreme High Command were enthusiastic about an invasion of the Commonwealth mainland, Zetua and Rudestorff were at wits' end over how few options they realistically had, given their army's fighting power. With circumstances such as they are, I think it makes sense to launch operations in the south with the objectives of blockading the inner sea and defeating the last of the Republican forces. For that reason, as part of their plan to handle the war situation, they first considered a southern campaign against the remnants of the Republican army. They would demonstrate that the empire was capable of sending troops to the colonies. Such a reality could inspire at least the Republican army and colonies to make peace. To the Imperial Army General Staff, who could no longer find any point in the war, that speculation was a realistic plan of compromise to end the fighting quickly. If they could settle things without occupying every last hostile country and just negotiate, that would be easier. Allow me to make one point. I understand what you're saying, but our nation has limited power projection capabilities, and our maritime forces on the inner sea are equally tight. You're quite right, Zetua. That's why I'm asking you. As Zetua pointed out the difficulties and Rudestorff grudgingly agreed, neither the fleet's strength nor the Empire's projecting power supposed even a limited-scale overseas invasion. Even the suppression of neighboring countries was a strain on the Imperial Army, since it was set up for domestic interior lines operations. Under these circumstances, the most we could do on the southern front would be combat on a limited scale for mainly political purposes. Will that work? Which was why Zetua emphasized that they wouldn't be able to expect much from the military on the southern front, saying that no matter how effective it would be, from a purely military perspective, they couldn't expect to have command of the inner sea and be able to cut off transport routes. That's no problem. Our main objective is to draw the Kingdom of Ildoa to our side by supporting them down there. I get where you're coming from, and I won't deny an idea just because it isn't purely military in nature. In response to the warning, Rudestorff smiled and said he would readily accept politics as a limiting factor. It would be a nerve-wracking battlefield, Butevan if it was as roundabout as open sesame on the Rhine front. Rudestorff and Zetua were interested in any operation that would be effective. They figured anything useful was worth trying. Even in the worst case, having a sympathetically neutral Kingdom of Ildoa would tell the Republic and Commonwealth that we could threaten their lifelines, especially in the colonies. That actually is something we need, but the usual logistical problems, Rudestorff asked with a perplexed expression. Zetua always spoke confidently, as if he were reading a formula or theory, so it was rare for him to trail off. Are our supply and communications lines really so strained? No, those issues I can overcome. I just can't shake the feeling that it would be essentially a pointless deployment. Is a limited peace impossible? I don't mean to throw your words back at you, but why would a limited peace be impossible? We just do as Supreme High Command wills. A brief silence fell between them, and after meditating on the question, why can't we end the war, there was only one answer. Ultimately, I suppose the problem is that we haven't completely defeated the enemy. It was all he could do to voice the words. Not fully defeating the enemy was a most regrettable error. Their chance had slipped through their fingers while they were drunk on celebrating their triumph. Of course, their victory was still a victory. Encirclement, annihilation, advance, occupation. Everything proceeded according to plan, and the Imperial Army had eliminated all their enemies. But there was one element missing from their celebration: the end of the war and the restoration of peace. Now that the Republican fleet they let escape had turned into a headache, shouting about resistance to the bitter end, peace seemed awfully far away. Thus, both of the generals felt the need to put the last nail in the coffin. If we must, then all we have to do is beat them. In that sense, if you think of sending troops to the southern continent as a move for the sake of peace, it's not a bad idea. Which was why Rudestorff declared that they wouldn't make the same mistake twice. They would simply defeat anyone who stood in their way. Understood? Then arrange the right troops and commanders. Zetua's cheeks relaxed into a smile when he nodded in response to that confident reply. Yet something in his face said it still wasn't sitting right with him, and he repeated his previous comment. But I'd like you to bear one thing in mind, or rather, I want to reconfirm it with you. We're a nation with a land army, and we've prioritized interior line strategy. As you say, you've pointed that out many times. The Imperial Army was designed and outfitted to move around inside the country. Sadly, the Empire was in a mad rush to give them a measure of expeditionary capability, but the army's logistics arm had been overworked since the war started, and there were already reports of complicated obstacles. That's right. Going to war in a foreign country is likely to put quite a strain on the army's support services. Even if the sea command situation is different than in the waters near the Commonwealth mainland, an operation on the southern continent is still an overseas operation. We'll have to be prepared for some losses. Zetua hesitated, then continued, but that's why I intend to deploy mainly light divisions. I don't plan on sending in very large units. You've said you understand that, so there should be no problem. As the one in charge of the operation, I don't have a problem with light divisions. Do you? No, there shouldn't be any issues. They knew it would be a difficult expedition, which was why they chose light divisions. But the way Zetua said there shouldn't be any issues, Rudersdorf couldn't help but hear some hesitation. My friend, what is it you want to say? We must have made a mistake, don't you think? The way Major von de Guritschaff had shown up at the General Staff office, apparently wanting to say something, had lingered strangely in the back of his mind. He knew right away that she had hesitated and returned to her base, unable to say whatever it was. Now he could only speculate, but he almost had the feeling that back then she had wanted to scream at him. You're making a mistake. It was too late now, but he wished he had heard her out. That's why he asked his brother-in-arms, were we wrong? Rudersdorf, for his part, felt much the same as Zetua. Have we made a mistake? It was a strange feeling. But now that he mentioned it, yes, it was true. I'm sure we did. Remember that in war we have an opponent, so things won't always go as we'd-like. It's not uncommon that an enemy responds in an unexpected way, right? You're just so good at reading them that you don't screw up often enough. But though Rudersdorf didn't deny the error, he was going to cut his losses and not get overly caught up in it. In the fog of war, not every shot could hit the bullseye. All they could do was their best, and if they got the second best results, then hoping for anything more was too much, if you say so. Anyhow, let's keep the burden to the minimum. Very well. Frankly, I'd like to have as many reserve units on hand at home as I can, so it'd be better if you could make do with as few as possible. Zetua was especially concerned with keeping the load light, and Rudersdorf nodded in agreement. It was certainly desirable to minimize the strain on logistics. So he continued. Okay, how about you give me those guys again? Your unit, the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion, he added. They are only a 50-man load on logistics, but they pack more punch than the usual augmented battalion, so it'd be very efficient. As the one in charge of the operation, he also noted that having a simple-to-deploy mobile fighting force would yield the advantage of extended range of use. I need them to take out other aerial mages. Plus, if you unleash her without thinking, there's no telling how far she'll advance. But anyone would want to keep such a precious asset handy. Zetua wasn't about to let it go so easily. She'll lead the charge. I need her to mess them up down there. Let me have them. No, Simon, let me have them. The exchange between the two generals nearly went on forever, but Rudersdorf's stubbornness finally paid off. Fine, I'll arrange it. Now then, I'm off to the next meeting to give formal notification of this. What about you? As Zetua complained about more pain-in-the-ass arrangements to make, Rudersdorf let it go in one ear and out the other, and barreled right into the next topic. Sorry, I'm leaving this up to you. I'd like to inspect our troops, assuming we're heading into a fight with the Commonwealth. Got it, let me know what you find out. No problem, great, then let's both make it happen. August 29, Unified Year 1925, Imperial Army General Staff Office, joint meeting between the Service Corps and Operations. It's the appointed hour. A young officer announced in a nervous voice that it was time to start. Very well. I would like to begin the meeting to consider our plan to end the fighting on the Republican mainland and in the Entente Alliance, as well as the conflict with the Commonwealth that will entail. It was a meeting to decide the Imperial military's basic direction. Naturally, all the most important figures in the General Staff from the Chief on down were there. The agenda was simple. They would iron out the conflicting opinions about what the major course of action in the war should be. First, regarding the end of the fighting on the Northern Front, please see the documents you've been given. It's finally over. Though that wasn't entirely accurate, it seemed the best way to describe the dispute in the north where the lines had been suppressed and a military government was in place. Finally, the long-awaited good news from the troubles and confusion of the northern area had come, although they couldn't deny it was a bit late. Their opponents had hung on for so long, even after their military and national strength had been overpowered. Of course, the fact that they had help from other powers couldn't be ignored. Even so, this had cost the Empire an awful lot of time and effort. For that reason, the faces of the generals in attendance looked far from happy. But they judged those thoughts to be sentimental and did not indulge them. Their job was to receive and approve the reports after the fact, but they were most interested in the current issues with the Commonwealth and the remnants of the Republic. They were already taking the practical stance that the Entente alliance was only a matter of military governance. All that was left to do was pull together the might the service corps and operations required, and choose someone to rule. So the military governor will be chosen after consulting with Supreme High Command and the Personnel Division in the General Staff. This matter was concluded quickly with no complicated debate, just a couple questions regarding the finer details. The meat of the conference was the next item. Moving on, I'd like to discuss the operation on the southern continent proposed by Service Corps Deputy Chief von Zetua. After being called on by the leader of the meeting, Lieutenant General von Zetua stood. He had recently been promoted due to the success of his plan to lure in and annihilate the Republican Army. His next plan was another that split opinion in the General Staffer plan to check the Commonwealth mainland using the Great Army. They would mass the Great Army in the Republic as a show of force, while continuing their struggle for supremacy. He proposed a simultaneous operation on the southern continent using second-string units and whatever elites they could muster as a sort of offensive. At a glance, it seemed like he was placing importance on capturing the southern continent. But actually, as it was mainly an almost passive reorganization of the lines, and internally in the army they took it as a defensive plan. Naturally, making the southern continent the main battlefield and waging war outside the empire was better for the country's defense. The analysis that defending the colonies, removed from the mainland as they were, would strain the Commonwealth's supply lines also made sense. Still, on the whole, the imperial staff took the proposal as a way to buy the time to reorganize their main forces. Zetua proposed it for the purpose of conducting effective harassment. Some began to murmur that it was too passive. Wouldn't it be simpler to just send the main forces over to the Commonwealth mainland? There were even whispers that it could be the deciding battle. Naturally, the enemy had to protect both their mainland and their colonies. As a result, the colonies would probably be short on muscle. It went without saying, then, that the colonies would be easier to defeat. And if they succeeded in defeating the colonies, that would shave off a chunk of the Commonwealth's ability to continue fighting, and the foundations of the Free Republic or whatever they called themselves would crumble. And that was why everyone was after a decisive battle on the Commonwealth mainland. Still, those same men did recognize the effectiveness of an operation on the southern continent. For one thing, it wouldn't be so hard to get the necessary troops together. For another, they liked that the threat of defeat in the homeland would divide up enemy troops. Still, the majority wanted to avoid a roundabout operation and called for a direct strike on the Commonwealth mainland. If we do that, the war will end, they said. But Zetua felt the exact opposite. Well, force the enemy to exhaust themselves on the southern continent. During that time, the most pressing matters of putting down the partisans in the territory were occupying and reorganizing the troops. He wasn't optimistic about their ability to take over the Commonwealth mainland, ignoring the risks even if they managed to conduct a landing operation at the end of an all-or-nothing naval battle. He could imagine that the imperial troops would be exhausted. His greatest fear was that if that happened, some other power would interfere. "I object. The Great Army is capable of rapid response. We should attack the Commonwealth before they fortify their defences. Kindly recall the disparity of power between our navies. We don't have command of the sea." At the same time, there was the practical issue of the Commonwealth's superior navy. The Imperial Navy simply didn't match it in terms of quality or quantity. Efforts in recent years had seen their naval power rapidly expand, but they had to admit they were still behind. All the more reason to command the sky with our air and mage forces. Of course, any general at the meeting was aware of that. Though individually its ships outperformed those of the Commonwealth, the Empire couldn't win with hardware alone. The elements of training and skill were important, and neither could they discount the absoluteness of numbers. What could compensate for those things were the Empire's air and mage forces. As a matter of course, they imagined the air and mage forces would be used to wear down the enemy, achieve air supremacy and weaken the enemy with anti-ship strikes. That could be said to be a rather ordinary idea, and the imperial military was prepared for it. Having gained experience on the Rhine front, those in the rear could attempt to provide more support, but the Channel was still a big strategic obstacle for the imperial army. The attack required crossing water, which was a real headache for the planners. Honestly, I don't like the idea of a battle of attrition on enemy turf. They were picking the wrong opponent if they wanted to fight a prolonged battle to wear the enemy down. A battle of attrition at a powerful nation's home base was a tricky proposition. One wrong move and the Empire would be the first to exhaust itself. The fighting on the Rhine front had been along the border, so the parties had been on equal terms. But in an air battle over the enemy mainland, the enemy's fighting spirit would be running high. And if an enemy were shot down, they could rejoin the lines immediately. Fighting on their own turf, they didn't have to worry about being taken prisoner when they hit the ground. But if one of the Imperial Army's soldiers was shot down, they would be lucky to be taken prisoner. At that rate, even if they were downing each other at the same pace, the actual losses per side would be completely different. And naturally, since the imperial military couldn't endure the same rate of loss as its enemy, it would constantly have to limit attrition on its own side while making things harder for the Commonwealth side. It wasn't impossible, but doing it in real life would be a challenge, indisputably. Time is what we should be worried about. Once the enemy strengthens their defences, it will be too late. At the same time, an invasion of the enemy mainland once its defences were fortified would be reckless. Several staffers said a short war was the only way to resolve things and insisted on an offensive. If we don't attack now, they said, we'll be stuck facing heavily defended enemy positions and fortifications on the scale of the Rhine front. We can strengthen our defences during that time as well. It seems to me our positions will be equal. Zetua's idea was simple. He believed the army was meant to protect the empire, not the occupied territory. Therefore, the biggest priority wasn't to expand the occupied territory, but to conserve troops. Of course, it went without saying that he wanted to do that while bleeding the enemy. Please understand the organizational limitations inherent in the fact that our army was arranged according to interior line strategy, with national defense in mind. We've sacrificed quite a lot of our expeditionary abilities in order to have qualitatively better, stronger soldiers. Yes, there was also the issue that doing so was really the only way to maintain such a large area. But ultimately, we can't end the war without muscling into their territory and forcing them to surrender. Your concerns are valid, General von Zetua, but please understand that staying on the battlefield forever because of them will eat away at our national strength. In short, it didn't matter one bit how the war was ended. In that sense, Zetua wasn't convinced it was absolutely necessary to conquer the Commonwealth mainland. On the contrary, he started to think it was a horrible idea that would bog them down, and the folly of going in with naval power was self-evident. He believed that their chance of victory lay not in fighting on the enemy's turf, but in drawing them to the battlefield of the empire's choosing. But he was vexed because circumstances wouldn't allow him to declare that openly. The others were proud of defeating the Republic and certain they could slay the Commonwealth in the same smooth motion. The operation planners under Lieutenant General von Rudestorff were more understanding, but the people and the bureaucrats had a tendency to say, "Oh, the Imperial Army can handle it," and expect too much. So Zetua reluctantly proposed a limited offensive. He narrowed it down to an operation that gave the best return with the most limited bloodshed. Concealing his true feelings, he advocated for an attritional containment plan. He had no other choice. The front on the southern continent was a desert. Unlike on the mainland, a hard rule applied there: survival of the fittest. At the time, there were three powers with influence on the southern continent: the Commonwealth, the Republic, and the Ispagna Collective. Of them, the Ispagna Collective had managed to remain neutral mainly because it didn't have the wherewithal to intervene externally due to fierce internal political conflict. Complicating matters was the Kingdom of Ildoa trying to squeeze itself in and settle. The result was an ambiguously coloured map, with both the group formed by the Turkmen principalities and the Ildone settlements. The jumble of sovereignties in the region could be described in a word as chaos. Of course, one could paint the map in broad strokes. Most of the influence and puppet governments belonged to the Commonwealth and the Republic. Even if the nations of the southern continent were officially neutral, their allegiance was clear because of how they sent voluntary armies and offered supplies. But it wasn't as if everyone took the Reich as their enemy. For instance, countries whose interests clashed with those of the Commonwealth and the Republic in the struggle to acquire colonies on the southern continent sided with the Empire. A representative example would be the Kingdom of Ildoa. It wasn't very difficult for the Empire to ask the kingdom to form an alliance, given their common interests. Irritatingly to Republican diplomats, neighbouring rival countries hoping to expand their sphere of influence were glad to see the decline of the Republic. And that was why the Kingdom of Ildoa chose to ally with the Empire. Of course, the alliance didn't automatically mean it was at war with the Republic and Commonwealth. The agreement between the two countries basically provided that fighting was optional. There was no indication that joining the war was mandatory. At the time the Imperial Southern Continent Expeditionary Army Corps was deployed, the Kingdom of Ildoa remained officially neutral. It did, however, allow the stationing of troops there out of consideration as an allied country. The Empire, however, did not move on the offer very quickly. Because the Empire had made light of the southern continent, it only sent a single army corps made up of 2 divisions and a support unit, and the General Staff ended up having a heated debate about whether to commit more troops or not. The initial number of units was so few that the garrison of the Republican troops usually deployed there could have resisted them. Everyone thought at the time that the Imperial units would work on gathering more fighting power. After all, a single puny army corps didn't pose much of a military threat. Still, they agreed there was major political significance in the Imperial Army's presence. The Watcher analysis that Army Corps Commander von Rommel was dispatched for political reasons, namely, expansion of influence and respect for the Empire's ally, was widely shared as the plausible explanation, which was why everyone expected the lull to continue for the foreseeable future. Even the division of the General Staff involved in giving orders to the Imperial Army was half serious about that idea. In any case, they had deployed some troops, but they weren't sure if the front should really be a priority or not. After all, there were no apparent gains to be made by sending troops there. If the objective hadn't been to wear the enemy out further in this total war, sending Imperial soldiers probably wouldn't have even been on the table. In that sense, predicting a lull was a respectable analysis. The betrayal of everyone's expectations occurred because of a surprising move in the field. The root cause was Commander von Rommel. Neither their enemies nor their allies thought the Southern Continent Expeditionary Corps was going to move, but the moment they arrived, they jumped into action. The world was reminded that a capable general doesn't waste time. The Commonwealth units who had just arrived to defend the Republican colonies probably got the worst of it. Those fresh troops hadn't been fully baptized on the battlefield, so they could think of no reason the two imperial divisions would be stationed on the southern continent, besides a political one. Having thus discounted them, the Commonwealth didn't even really go on guard. And that's how the imperial units under Commander von Rommel nailed every last one of them. The Imperial Army, waging maneuver warfare unparalleled in history against an enemy that outnumbered them by several times, simply bulldozed the Commonwealth troops in terms of caliber, partially because half of them were elites forged on the Rhine front. Hence the Commonwealth units, who hadn't dreamed they'd be fighting a mobile battle in the desert, were dealt an early brutal blow and sent scrambling in a disorderly retreat. It was obvious what strategy General de Lugo would adopt in response. He put some political moves on the Kingdom of Ildoa, while simultaneously doing what he could to ensure support wouldn't reach the Ildones. But Rommel was quicker than de Lugo was shrewd. Future generations would rave about his clever tactics. As soon as he realized time wouldn't necessarily work in his favor, despite having barely any units, he made a feint, hit the Chirou's naval base with a sneak attack and captured it. While securing a base that didn't depend on the Kingdom of Ildoa, he dealt a serious blow to Republican and Commonwealth logistics. The Chirou's naval base had been the Republican and Commonwealth supply base, so its fall had far-reaching effects. In the end, contrary to initial predictions, the Imperial Army Southern Continent Expeditionary Corps asserted its presence. Most importantly, imperial citizens went wild when they saw the string of successes. The people had been convinced the Empire had defeated the Republic on the Rhine lines after investing a vast amount of money and lives. To then continue the war risked the people starting to hate it. The General Staff weren't the only ones worried about that, but contrary to their estimates, the troops dominated on the southern continent. The winning streak continuing after Dasha and the Rhine sent the people into a frenzy. The battles unfolded as if the Empire's army was completely unrivaled. The excited citizens became pro-war and showed their support. As a result, the troops were expected to achieve even more. To the General Staff, that full picture was a big miscalculation. They welcomed it insofar as it meant receiving support for continuing the war. At least there were no signs that the people were under the influence of anti-war dissidents. That, the General Staff could wholeheartedly embrace. But the appearance of a hero in the southern continent and their growing inability to gauge a time to withdraw frightened them. The Loss Control faction in particular, rallying around Lieutenant General von Zetua, put up a powerful resistance against the aggressive faction seeking to increase war gains. To them, sending any more troops than absolutely necessary to the southern continent was a waste of resources that was difficult to accept. Even the strain on the supply lines would be insupportable. What about convoy ships? What about transport ships? What about direct support units? And it wasn't just the Loss Control faction fretting about these things. The mere thought of the mountain of challenges was enough to make any logistics officer want to bury their head in their hands and groan. Though the issue went further back than that. Given that the Imperial Army was organized around interior line strategy, they weren't even sure they could project their power properly in a foreign country. Moving a corps on the southern continent was totally different from moving one within their home country. Even a single rifle manufactured at home had to travel a complicated route to get to a soldier in the south. And they had to assume that some percentage of them would be damaged during transport and that whole ships could be sunk on the way. For the divisions concerned, it was worse than horrible, and in general, the Imperial army couldn't endure losses like that, and the Imperial military had only envisioned seaborne transport capabilities as far as shuttling troops to and from the Imperial-occupied territory in Norden. As a result, there hadn't been an urgent need to aggressively acquire transport ships, and maintenance was performed very slowly. On top of that, the Empire was a land nation with very little concept of major sea route defense. Even their theoretical knowledge of convoying stopped at a basic awareness that was sure to come back around to bite them. The Commonwealth and the Republic, on the other hand, were self-sustaining to some extent thanks to a degree of industrial base in the colonies. Not only that, but they had more ships than they could count. Meanwhile, the Imperial army could count on supplies from the new areas of Imperial influence, of course, but the Empire was only connected to them insomuch as they had common interests. Naturally, any respectable soldier would be apprehensive about relying on supplies from there, so the General Staff ended up in another heated debate. Everyone felt they had to stop the front from expanding any farther, but could they really ignore the enemy? They were right there. For Zetua, who had decided that they should consider shaping up the lines if need be, the time had come to devote themselves to overhauling the organization of their defensive lines and exercising their influence on other countries behind the scenes. But before the General Staff reached their conclusion, another report came flying in from the south. It was notice of what could be called a great victory. The news that the troops were in the process of increasing their gains with a follow-up attack would simultaneously send the people into a renewed frenzy and cause logistical difficulties for Zetua. Luckily, Zetua didn't know that yet. September 4, Unified Year 1925, the Imperial capital. He still couldn't forget his impression the first time he saw the unit getting deployed to the southern continent. He had been excited to hear about his reports, but then there were only 2 divisions on the roster. One was a light infantry division, a new unit made up of mainly fresh troops and reserves. As for the other division, consisting of the few veterans had been allotted, not even a generous evaluation would say they were in good shape. They may have had fighting power on paper, but they had sustained heavy losses on the Rhine front. General von Rommel had served in the Rhine, so he was more than well aware of how that would affect their strength. Any normal commander would despair if they couldn't expect power commensurate to their head count. To Rommel, the order to fight the southern campaign with some scraped-together second-string troops was preposterous, which was why he petitioned the General Staff for additional troops, but he didn't get a proper answer. Unable to bear the status quo, he made a direct request, and the answer he received after much pestering was the additional deployment of an augmented mage battalion. And how generous it was, the fine unit reporting directly to the Service Corps and Operations in the General Staff. He was thrilled to get a first-string unit with proper gear, combat experience, and a full lineup. But the high spirits that nearly had him shouting for joy were crushed when he received the commander's evaluations. No, the evaluations themselves were fine. The Academy, for instance, said she was up to the field officer standards. That alone made her a promising officer. Also, she had completed higher education in the War College to qualify as a General Staff officer, rare for a magic officer. And the War College also had nice things to say about her, that she met all standards desirable for an officer. These were, well, fairly favourable evaluations. They guaranteed that she possessed more than the standard knowledge of either a staff or field officer. But now it was wartime. The most important evaluations during a war are the ones from the battlefield, and those were all over the place. There was a pile of especially severe criticism from the Northern Army Group. They said she was transferred after voicing a clear objection to those in authority. The Western Army Group declined to evaluate her, saying her good and bad points neutralized each other, so it was difficult to rate her. Furthermore, she had attempted to resist orders. She was truly a hard one to judge, but if her good points balanced out her bad points despite an attempt to disobey orders, he could smell some sort of competence. But that didn't mean he wanted the type of officer who would try such a thing under his command. And in this situation where he had so few units, the commander of the unit he should rely on the most was such a character. It was beyond ridiculous. Rommel continued reading with a fed-up look on his face, but the ambiguous comments from the tech labs that, though the project she had been on had achieved things, it wasn't worth it didn't do anything to make him feel better. After reading, he thought two things. One was that almost all of these evaluations were from HQ. Apparently, the troops serving directly under her thought she was a great field officer. Still, it was rare to receive such a difficult person as a subordinate. Majors who followed orders but objected to the brass plans had a tendency to get passed over. After all, they were hard to handle. The second was that although the evaluations were contradictory, she had achieved enough that she was considered an outstanding soldier. Awkwardly, regardless of how she was as an officer, as an individual mage, she was thought very highly of. Her number of kills was among the highest on the Rhine front. Plus, as a field officer, she had led breakthrough charges and ambushes unfazed. One officer called her Mad Dog. Apparently, the trendy nickname for her at the moment was Rusted Silver, and he could see how that made sense. The ring of it was far from the elegance of her alias White Silver, but he found it an appropriate one. Had heard that the Republicans called her the Devil of the Rhine. In any case, strictly as a mage, she was unrivaled. As an officer, too, she was by no means incompetent, so they must have been giving her to him as reinforcements and as an excuse to get her out of their hair. Honestly, he felt like they were foisting off their problem on him. Thea telling me to take a mad dog out on a walk with no leash, he let slip a complaint. Maybe it was just prejudice, but that wasn't what it felt like to General von Rommel. After all, he was basically being asked to bet on a bad hand. This isn't some joke. I'm not going to send my men to their doom so easily. That bunch in the general staff are only looking at the death toll as a statistic. Thus, he ended up muttering complaints about the general staff's practice of pushing its neck pains onto those in the field. Well, I'll at least meet her. General von Rommel had decided to wait for Major von de Guritschaf. That was his way of showing respect for a magic officer who had gotten results, although his preconceived notions led him to brace himself when her arrival was announced. He invited her into his office to have her report in, and once they got through the dispassionate formalities, his bad habit of trying to figure people out reared its head. But he was already surprised to see that Major von de Guritschaf, like him, preferred formal, matter-of-fact exchanges. After all, majors and officers were a proud bunch. Perhaps you could say they were too proud, but either way, everyone in the imperial military knew it for a fact. So he had expected the magic officer to be the aggressive, violent type, despite her outward appearance. And Rommel himself expected that sort of person to get a bit upset or even angry at being welcomed with such bureaucratic fluff. So it was a refreshing surprise to find that she calmly replied with the same empty courtesy, completely unshaken. At that point, Rommel admitted to himself that his calculations had been off. A magic officer with no sense of shame. Maybe that's why she ignored orders and attempted to resist. His concerns as an officer in combat crossed his mind. True, she has a stout heart, but she's the type to take matters into her own hands. He could sense it instinctively, and that worried him. How did she decide? As Rommel started to worry, de Guritschaf interrupted. Lastly, General, I'd appreciate the authority for my battalion to act independently. Graciously, with a poker face, she continued, the General Staff has approved it, and the way she made her request was so arrogant it was invigorating. Rommel was said to be overly proud himself, so the fact that she casually made this amazingly brazen request was fantastic. Any commissioned officer would understand just from hearing her make that one comment why the northern and western groups couldn't control her. Having a mage battalion drop out of the command structure was almost like losing a whole division. Normally, no commander could possibly accept a separate chain of command. That goes without saying. And Major von de Guritschaf, now that you've said that much, I'm sure I can expect your unit to achieve great things, right? But apparently, she didn't care for Romel's reaction. Her silence made it clear she objected to his doubt of their ability. As an attitude taken in response to a superior officer's question, it was unbelievably insolent. But it actually made Romel realize why his superiors had given him the cold shoulder. Even Romel hadn't been this bumptious. Well, what do you think? He pressed her for a response, unconsciously hardening his voice. If she didn't answer now, he didn't care what the General Staff said he would send her back. General von Romel, with all due respect, I merely omitted the effort of responding to a question that is impossible to answer. What? But the response he got made him answer with another question. What did she just say? A question that's impossible to answer. I'm a soldier, not a smooth talker. I'm afraid I'm unable to explain our military capability in words. Her tone suddenly changed. In addition to her self-important attitude, it exuded heavy sarcasm. And even if I were, I doubt it would satisfy you, sir. Therefore, I am unable to answer. The words rang in his ears. He heard them, they were in the official language of the Empire, pronounced correctly in the standard imperial way. He had no trouble making them out. Her voice was clear as a bell. Despite that for a moment he couldn't fathom her intentions. Did the girl in front of me really just say something I can't follow? He struggled to understand. Then a little while later he finally grasped the significance of the string of words. In other words, you mean seeing is believing, that's what you want to say. I respectfully leave the interpretation up to you. General, please trust me and my unit. Silence. In her eyes was an earnest appeal. If it was only a ruse, it was madness. He was dumbfounded in spite of himself. The feeling could only be described as shock at having witnessed something unbelievable. A single thought came to mind: frontline syndrome. Major von de Guritschaf had countless symptoms of it. The way she warned him, albeit indirectly, don't ask stupid questions. The way she threatened him at the same time, don't you understand how powerful I am? But then there was the logic of her sincere responses. So not only was she arrogant, she was clearly horribly warped. She doesn't believe in anything. Not the power of the military's leadership, not the strategy, and probably not even her fellow soldiers. Despite that, she's surprisingly loyal to the Imperial Army. You could even call her a peerlessly loyal eccentric focused solely on being the nation's guard dog. I see Romel understood the reason she had been disobedient in the past. She simply decided that she would be a patriot if it was good for the nation. In short, she's a capable lunatic, but the bad part is she doesn't even realize she's twisted. Major, I don't have enough evidence to trust you. She's crazy, and competent, and more sincere than anyone I've known. Rare for Romel, she was someone he was unable to judge. He did know she wouldn't be easy to handle. That was why he asked how he could trust her. It's pointless for me to enumerate my feats. I'm at your service, and her response was an obvious point. Romel could appreciate the attitude that actions speak louder than words usually. She wasn't conceited about her ability, neither was she a slave to her power. She spoke matter-of-factly. She was probably capable of judging what was possible and what would be difficult. If not, she couldn't play with fire in front of an ammunition dump like she was now. In short, her insanity was backed up by limitless ability. He could only conclude she was crazy. I want to see what you can do. No, don't misunderstand. I mean as a strategist. I'll call her a hero, a nut, a fellow soldier. So she needs to demonstrate what she's capable of. Is she merely a wild animal tainted by madness? Or is she a cunning beast in possession of a deranged intellect? Romel suddenly realized he wanted to know the answer. I'm sending you on a flying mission. I'd like you to take the second group. Incidentally, the idea is to give you, as Kampfgruppe 7, authority on par with the other Kampfgruppen even though you're a single battalion. Don't disappoint me. I'll try her out in a somewhat independent mission. Well, I have an idea how it will turn out, but I hope she gets results. Understood, well, meet your expectations. Just look at that evil grin. She looks thrilled. She's so happy to have a place to fight. Without a doubt, she's going to end up being the most horrible person I know. And she'll probably also be one of my most reliable friends on the battlefield. Chapter VI: The Southern Campaign. September 22, Unified Year 1925, the Southern Continent. Well, take out all enemy artillery. Major von de Guritschaf, what about your unit? Reconnect me. Give me HQ. We've got signal jamming 1105. Request a bypass. The improvised field command post is in an uproar over the signal interruption. On the southern front, where the fighting has rapidly escalated, everyone has lost their cool. Well, that's how it was on the Rhine. It'd be strange if you were composed on the battlefield. And here is Tanya, her days in the southern lands no different from her days in the west. She already knows to try patching through HQ on the wired line when the wireless won't connect. She has experienced practically every type of combat communications problem possible in both trench and high maneuver warfare. She's versed in the countermeasures, so she doesn't panic at this degree of trouble. She promptly proceeds through the checklist of actions that need to be taken. The radio operators immediately open a wired line to HQ. Their efficiency is praiseworthy. Despite the brief command chain disruption, they cope without hesitating. But after a brief exchange, their faces go pale. It's not jamming. There isn't any noise. We have clear connections with units in the area. The issue is mechanical trouble on the 44 THS side. Ah, damn it, she curses in her head because she knows what that would have meant on the Rhine lines. The same surely goes for anyone baptized on that front. Keep calling, shortwave is fine. Inspect our equipment one more time just in case. Hurry. She wants to pin her hopes on a slim possibility, but she doesn't expect anything. Sometimes it's better to be a pessimist and expect the worst on the battlefield rather than get your hopes up. Hope is important, but if you rely on that morphine in battle, you'll be ruined. I suppose you could say it's going as expected. One of the radio operators promptly checks out the machine, but it's fine. The machines are all operating normally. They insist that if everything here is fine, it means the 44th Mage Battalion is having mechanical trouble. If that's true, it's not good. This is a high maneuver battle in the Barbad Desert. If they can't contact the command post of Kampfgruppe 7, the vanguard of the left flank, it will cause more than confusion in the chain of command. What is going on? The officers are getting frustrated, but they have the self-control to not let it show on their faces. It's axiomatic that if officers get needlessly shaken in front of their soldiers, confusion will rapidly increase. Even the greenest officer, Second Lieutenant Grants, knows that. We've established contact. On the shortwave, the pass code matches. For a moment, relief drifts through the improvised field command post. Tanya can't help but have a sober opinion about that. I guess the younger officers and less experienced guys can't help but think positively. It's not easy for a logical, economically minded person to form the habit of expecting the worst either. It's even true in financial deals that aren't life or death. The logic of behavioral economics brilliantly reveals that when you apply it to bubbles and crises, it must be hard to optimistically prepare for the worst on a battlefield for these guys who don't have enough experience. Tanya grumbles in her mind. Major von Leinberg has been killed in action. It's the worst news, but it doesn't have to be a catastrophe, so she is relieved in her own way. She takes a discreet glance around the command post and sees that the old-timers understand the situation well and are working their brains to get things under control. It doesn't seem like things will descend into a damaging panic. Not bad. When she was criticized and sent to the south for trying to take matters into her own hands and nearly resisting orders, the silver lining was that she was able to bring her battalion. Thanks to that, the time she has to spend on education is halved. No, if she delegates part of it to her subordinates, she can halve it again. In other words, rather than having to educate everyone at her own expense, she can get away with bearing only 25% of the burden of time and effort. Now that's what you call efficient. Anyhow, any outstanding organization is constantly being maintained so its gears don't rust. Humans are the guts of an organization. And naturally, an army incorporates fatalities into the planning and maintenance of its organization. In other words, things are arranged so that the death of a single Kampfgruppe commander, no matter how great a soldier he was, won't disturb the logic of the military organization. An army that is an aggregate of countless people who can substitute for one another is a terribly expensive but extremely resilient organization. HQ is calling Kampfgruppe 7 over a wide area. They lost contact with Major von Leinberg. Though it came in via shortwave, the report from the friendly unit is that he was killed. Unless people really have their heads in the clouds, command is transferred to the next officer in line as soon as possible to minimize the impact to the chain. And in the Empire, where Thayer used to wars, command succession is rare but not unheard of. Sadly, in this war, however, so many high-ranking leaders have fallen that command succession is becoming normalized. As of this moment, command of Kampfgruppe 7 falls to Major von de Guritschaf. They say to get to work on reorganizing the lines immediately. De Guritschaf, Roger, you can tell HQ. The delivery of the notification was skillful enough to suggest it was well practiced, and Tanya shouts her assent. She wants to yell about how she's being overworked, but she just barely manages to deny herself and refrain. As the deputy commander of Kampfgruppe 7, her duty under these circumstances is to make the best judgment possible. As long as it's her duty, avoiding it is against her contract. Premodern barbarians may have committed such injustices, but as a cultured citizen with a modern education, she absolutely cannot. So to carry out her duty, she pulls out a map that shows what vague enemy information they have and starts to get a handle on the situation. Then just as she leans over to mark the place where Major von Leinberg and his unit were attacked, something grazes her back. Her body reacts before her brain has time to think. She instantaneously covers her head and hits the ground. Guided essentially by experience, she crawls along the earth on alert for another shot. Right after that, something rips a hole through the tent, and she hears the awful sound of whatever it was ricocheting off a building outside. Judging from the direction, it came from extremely close to the Commonwealth Republican Army's defensive position. They've got snipers out. Shit, 40mm anti-magic sniper rounds. Someone shouts a warning, and people sluggishly start to respond, but it's too late. I'm so impatient I want to scream at them that a civilian security company would respond faster. They don't even have to check the damage to know what kind of ordnance is being used. Any mage is familiar with it. The 40mm anti-material rifle. It's the most powerful non-magic gun. More often pointed at mages than material, it's popularly known as the anti-magic rifle. It's a natural enemy of any mage. By comparison, getting shot at with shells with heavy metal casings that can almost nullify interference formulas isn't scary at all. You can take several direct hits from most heavy machine guns, and in the worst case your defensive shell will block them. But these 40mm rounds hardly meet any resistance, ripping through protective films, and can pierce defensive shells too. Apparently the Commonwealth is quite proud of them. Like they resign themselves to hunting mages instead of the traditional foxes or something. They probably supplied the Republic with these guns too. Damn that country. If nothing else, they always take sports and war seriously. Well, I'll just consider us lucky we're not being used for duck hunting practice. Suppressive fire, pin the enemy down. We have perimeter defense to prevent just these sorts of hazards from getting anywhere near us. The fact that it isn't functioning in the slightest pisses me off. Some of us are working diligently, so what is everyone else doing? Their inaction makes her want to clench the sand in her fists and scream as she lies on the ground. She can't stand it. Their performance is so terrible, she wants to shout, her voice raw, inquiring what the hell the people around her are doing. Though a 40mm is small enough for a person to carry, it's not the sort of thing you can hide. This is such a screw-up that if these weren't second-string troops, she would consider it willful laziness. She suppresses her emotions and keeps herself from clicking her tongue, but her anger won't subside. If they had been properly on guard, the enemy couldn't possibly have gotten this close. We can't be getting sniped at so easily. Normally it would never be allowed. On top of that, I can't believe I'm the one who nearly got shot. They almost took my head off. It's terrifying to think my logical ideas, which have the potential to contribute to anthropological economics, could be ended with savage violence. My human capital investments nearly defaulted. If she went so short, I would have been in trouble. Tanya realizes she is thankful for her height for the first time in a while. If she had been just a little bit taller, she would have taken a direct hit to the head when she bent over. She isn't sure whether to feel happy or sad, but given that she's alive, she opts for happy. In any case, what she immediately thinks of are the basic steps to countering snipers. The classic way is to thoroughly bombard the suspected hiding place. Not that the Imperial Army's supply lines are sturdy enough to allow for such extravagant shell use. But lamentably, if not doing it puts me in danger, it must be done. After all, if we were in trenches, we could sweep through area by area, but this is a desert. Here, the enemies can hide in the shadows of sand dunes, so it would take an awful lot of time and effort to find them. Blow up the entire area to get the snipers. In that case, in order to keep myself safe, unhesitatingly attacking the whole area is the correct choice. You may not be able to use that tactic in the city, but in the desert there's no need for scruples. What was our direct support doing? Get rid of them, no. Just then, her aide-de-camp Weiss gains temporary control. He takes the lead on eliminating the snipers by sending the response team as reinforcements. Thanks to that, Tanya can focus on patching up the chain of command, which she's grateful for. Yeah, no matter the era, an exceptional vice commander will always come in handy. He's so brilliant that if I were in personnel, I'd be advocating for his promotion. Anyhow, having left the odd jobs up to her subordinate, Tanya has to get cracking on her own prioritized list of tasks. She can't just wait around for orders and intel to come in. If she doesn't get an understanding of the situation and decide what to do about it soon, they could suffer losses. That makes even Tanya nervous, but she can't let the people around her see that. Luckily, the radio operator and the apparatus are safe. They had contact. She should handle things calmly with the usual smile. Just like negotiating, this situation can benefit from putting up a brave front. This is Major von de Guritschaf. I've assumed command. Report your status. She laughs as she warmly informs the radio operator, I nearly just met the same fate as your boss. The reply comes back filled with the same humor. If she can smile, then they can smile back, I guess. That's a good sign. If it were a stiff, nervous newbie who had survived, she would have lost hope. It's always easier to do your job when you have a partner or competitor in a negotiation who you can trust. That's got to be true not just in business but everywhere. 44th Battalion to CP. Captain Carlos here, I've taken over command. She also appreciates that he asks if she's injured. A commander can't let any complaints slip out under these circumstances, so even if you're hurt, all you can do is deal. Man, even the lower-ranking officers in the Imperial Army have guts. Tanya adds in her head, suddenly feeling relaxed, this is fun. After all, if anyone goes into hysterics, the only thing to do is accidentally shoot them, so nothing helps more than having tough officers. The fact that he's not in total panic, even though his commander was just blown away, is worthy of special mention. Of course, even corporate life would have been fun with this sort of subordinate. Thinking back on all the trouble and confusion training successors entailed, I feel like there's a lot companies could learn from the army. I should write a book about this for corporate managers. A business book about administration strategy based on military strategy sure would have been useful. The needs are definitely there. Captain Carlos, this is Major von de Guritschaf. Your reception's bad. Can you improve it? The trouble is the grainy signal. She has a connection but via shortwave, and on a battlefield the quality is outrageously bad. My apologies, this is the best I can do. An enemy sniper took out all the machines. I guess this is what we have to work with then. Well, let's get down to business. The trip south on the boat was quite pleasant. Maybe it was because their ride was a converted Reichspost cargo ship. For a ship to transport troops, it was remarkably comfortable. Come to think of it, the good treatment probably relaxed them too much. But there was nothing to be done about that. Having just enjoyed the officer mess lunch of which the Navy was so proud, Grants and the others felt they had gotten a proper meal for the first time in a long while. Even the battalion commander was pleased enough to give it passing marks. That said, it's her fault that we're here in the first place. She had attempted to exceed her authority right before the ceasefire. Normally, that was the kind of spark that could cause major problems. After all, it was an outrage more like resisting orders than overstepping her authority. The operation was rejected by the normal procedure, and then her appeal was rejected. All that was fine. But once she grabbed the base commander's lapels and essentially threatened him, there was no way to cover it up. They had been just about to sortie after she shook off even his efforts to stop her. Yes, their sincere, conscientious battalion commander did that. It was enough to make First Lieutenant Weiss, her longtime aide-de-camp, wonder under his breath if she would get court-martialed. For a while it kept seeming like her summons would arrive, but ironically the arrival of an external threat blew all those issues away. The intervention of the Commonwealth. Nominally, the Republic had asked the Commonwealth to mediate peace negotiations. But then the negotiators offered the same terms that were rejected in the notice they sent before, with the assumption they would be rejected again. As such, anyone could see they had no intention of mediating peace talks. The terms were too biased. There was even a one-sided final notice. Of course, the Empire spurned the Commonwealth's ultimatum. As everyone expected, it was flatly rejected at once. But what the Empire didn't expect was the Republican government's declaration of total resistance. The Empire had been negotiating for peace with the Republic under the assumption of a conditional surrender. Instead, General De Lugo, leading the escaped remnants of the army, declared resistance as Vice Minister of Defense and began claiming that he and his supporters were the true Republican government. Officially, of course, the government was in the capital occupied by the Empire, but the troops and most of the colonies sided with De Lugo. Contrary to their beliefs that he was a Commonwealth puppet, De Lugo proclaimed the Free Republic. He mustered the colonies on the southern continent and called for continuing the war against the Empire. And the Republican forces stationed on the politically tumultuous southern continent were too heavily equipped to be called regional patrol units. The majors stationed there with an eye on countering the Commonwealth or the Kingdom of Ildoa posed no small threat. It went without saying that the Imperial Army General Staff was at wit's end. The Free Republic, which allied itself with the Commonwealth, was capable of mobilizing all of that against the Empire. The trick was to leave more than a certain number of troops on the mainland while taking care of the situation on the southern continent. Faced with such a challenge, the higher-ups apparently decided that they needed Grant's battalion commander, even though she had a tendency to take matters into her own hands. They did cancel all her pending decorations applications from the Rhine front, though she couldn't be completely defended. On the other hand, that was as far as their ire went. When it came to the commander, that treatment did seem par for the course. But as a result, people ended up conscious of how valuable it was to have a strong mage force. Grants and the others were surprised and delighted by the much improved pay they ended up getting. The one problem was that despite the raise in the desert-covered southern lands, there wasn't really a way to spend their salary anyway. The southern continent was famous for its harsh climate, so they could accept their fate to some extent, but they couldn't help but want to whine about how badly they longed for an ice-cold beer. Other than that, they were on board with the strategy of striking the Commonwealth and Republican colonies to take away their ability to continue fighting. Cracking down is a fine strategy. Both Lieutenant Weiss and the commander basically agreed on that point. The issue was the quality of the troops who were deployed to the south. They were undoubtedly second-string units. The reserves and replenishments that had been scraped together were severely lacking in training. They were so bad they made even Grant's, who had been treated like a chick, still wearing its eggshell on the Rhine front, seem like a fully prepared soldier. Surely that was why they saw value in using a unit baptized in iron on the Rhine. The gossipy old-timers placed bets on when General von Rommel, the corps commander, would explode. Incidentally, the most popular wager was that he had already lost his temper. That was how it was. The battalion was more than welcome due to all the veterans. One look at the transport ship was enough to see how wholeheartedly Commander von Rommel welcomed them. He clearly expects a lot from us. And having things expected of you isn't a bad thing. I want to punch my past self for thinking that. Magic Second Lieutenant Warren Grants mentally gave his past self a light wallop and then moved to focus on the situation before him. The mission was simple. It was a mission to counter snipers. In this limitless rolling desert zone with no shortages of hiding places, they had to find camouflaged snipers. The enemy was smart. They wouldn't be found so easily. So Grant's and his unit's only option was to blow the whole area sky high using explosion formulas, but that method caused its own problems. No one had any idea how they could confirm whether they got them or not. HQ to all units. I say again, HQ to all units. On top of that, the desert dust put even their durable infantry rifles out of commission. The other machines were hopeless. Computation orbs did all right, but the bullets for holding formulas required frequent inspections on this battlefield. No matter how reliable the newest Type 97 assault computation orb was, if the critical magic bullets went stable, it was nearly impossible to function. But the higher-ups didn't take that into consideration. Or rather, they couldn't. After all, Commander von Rommel was going to wage his maneuver battles no matter how crazy the environment was. The announcement came in and said there were no changes in their orders. Close the flanks, I say again, close the flanks. It was maneuver warfare the moment they landed. Everyone was for attacking the enemy while they were off their guard, thinking it would take some time for them to get their supply lines and other logistics together. Fairy 01 to Kampfgruppe 7, it's just as we heard, were pushing the lines forward. Cerberus 01 to Kampfgruppe 3 were following Kampfgruppe 7, be ready to support the breakthrough. The problem lay with the doctrine of swinging around the back to encircle and annihilate while the center pinned the enemy down. The guys on the seaside had it a little better, but no one could stand being ordered to perform an outflanking maneuver in the sand. A long-distance march in the desert with barely any landmarks. And they did it at combat speed. Just the thought of Kampfgruppen 7 and 3's level of training made them want to go back to the mainland or the beaches at Brest. Prepare for formation flying, stay in position, check the beacon, you report directly to the battalion commander. Formation flying orders, they followed the orders from CP and checked their receivers. Sure enough, the one putting out the guiding beacon was the battalion commander. Apparently, Major von de Guritschaf was flying in the lead. The guys from the Kampfgruppen were merely surprised, but what she was doing must have been really hard. She's commanding combat while leading the flight. Her brain must have superhuman processing power. I would get caught up navigating and be worthless as a commander. Though such thoughts were running through his mind, Grants prepared himself with practiced motions. This was his first highly mobile battle in the desert, but the basics were the same as always. He hadn't been at it for very long, but through repetition he had mastered taking an unsentimental view and prepping efficiently. If you don't want to go blind, check your goggles. At the same time, as a young officer, he was abundantly flexible and adaptable. He was one of the first people to understand why Major von de Guritschaf brought out bigger aviation goggles for desert combat. Lots of people complained about the big, heavy new goggles, but Grants made sure his subordinates wore them. They could mitigate the light to some degree and provided protection against sand. He understood instinctively that they were required gear for fighting in the harsh environment on the southern continent. Fairy 01 to Kampfgruppe 7. Begin the advance. All right, let's get going. Thus equipped, they would fight a war. It didn't matter where or what the environment was like. That was the will of both Second Lieutenant Grant's country and the other countries. So the soldiers had to do it. The same day, Free Republic Provisional National Defense meeting. The side making gains in battle surely celebrates. Meanwhile, the side suffering the losses finds the situation intolerable. Having drained his tea with a sigh, General de Lugo was looking up at the ceiling with a fed-up expression on his face. A nasty blame game was raging before him with no end in sight. He glanced at the participants before lowering his eyes to the documents on the table. Just getting one combat report together had required so much effort. Drafting the report of a single encounter had taken a lot out of him. He picked up the papers. Rather than conveying the course of the battle against the Imperial Army, most of the reports were made up primarily of criticism of colleagues and self-praise. It seemed like the colonial troops still took honor, courage, and chivalry very seriously and thought it was their duty to devote most of the pages of their reports to those topics. It was a truly unfortunate, outdated state of affairs. He scoffed in secret, thinking that a meeting for the sake of a meeting was a great way to put it. They were liable to destroy themselves before they managed to take back the fatherland. The discontent of the troops who had followed him from the mainland was also near the breaking point. But, no, now I can actually act. It was because he saw the opportunity that de Lugo was patiently going along with this farce. He needed to hold out for the right timing. Let's consider an operation to retake Toulouse. Having decided the time was ripe, the Supreme Commander ignored the tumult in the room and made his declaration. Before the escape, de Lugo had been a major general. It was an awfully high rank for his age, but there were many who had reached it before him. And in fact, he was the youngest general in the room, and it was quicker to count him rank-wise from the bottom. Normally, he was one of the generals who should have yielded to more senior officers. Yet he sat at the head of the table due purely to duty. He was Vice Minister of both Defense and the Armed Forces. It was because of his authority to take command of the army in case of emergency that he was able to lead the Republican forces now. Are our forces concentrated? I beg your pardon, General de Lugo, but what did you just say? Of course, though he had the authority, that was only on paper. Even though the generals dispatched to the colonial defense forces had fallen off the promotion track, they were still de Lugo's seniors. They went about to submissively listen to a general far younger than them who had graduated from the academy far more recently. Not to mention, de Lugo mentally added, viewing the situation objectively, these generals who got sent to the colonial armies probably don't think there is anything interesting about someone who stayed on the track at Central. De Lugo knew better than anyone that although they were nominally gathered to take back the fatherland, the situation inside the Free Republic was rather chaotic. In spite of this, it was lucky the colonial army accepted his command at least organizationally. Well, one could also say that rather than agreeing to him leading, the colonial commanders had no other moves to make and just didn't object. Still, de Lugo was the most competent among them, and he was blessed in that he had home country units he could rely on. While some of the troops he had brought with him were lacking in actual combat experience, some who'd been on the Rhine lines, and others had been in the middle of getting their equipment upgraded at Central, so overall they were quite powerful. And since the command structure had been built around de Lugo from the beginning, the forces were cohesive and well disciplined. Even if there were some supply issues, the troops that escaped from the homeland were still the ones best equipped. They were better off than the soldiers who had been in the colonies for a long time. That in itself spoke to the standards of the colonial forces. Above all, it was clear that the elite mages from home were a notch above the troops they joined up with. But de Lugo mentally cautioned himself. That's as far as it goes. They were relying on the colonial army for their connection to the administration and logistical support. On top of that, even if they were only sent here to be kept on payroll and nothing else, there were far more generals in the colonial forces than in the mainland troops he had brought. As a result, their relationship had been awkward, and rather than engaging in combat as an organization, they were more or less acting independently. They are, but I oppose. More than anything, De Lugo's position was vague. Just the order to concentrate the troops meant getting hit with a lot of red tape and bargaining. He faced opposition from the passive, do-nothing colonial bureaucrats. Even if he said something in a meeting, the other generals coolly argued back, and that was it. Our outdated values are an expression of our chivalrous spirit, upholding honor and self-respect, they would say with straight faces. But De Lugo knew that ultimately they were just resisting him going over their heads. That was the real issue. And even today they were opposing the advance of the army he had gathered to take back Toulouse. It was always like that, like pouring new wine into old wineskins. The units were supposed to support the Commonwealth defense, but when the Commonwealth requested reinforcements, he shamefully had to tell them they didn't have the fuel. Maybe we just don't get along, but that was an idiotic mistake. When the chief of logistics calmly informed him they didn't know where to get fuel, De Lugo had to push the boundaries of his patience. He wanted to scream back at him, "How many years have you guys been governing this colony?" On top of that, unbelievably, some of the units had been assigned to protect the general's own interests. This was what they got for taking idiots who thought of colonial service as leisure time and leaving them to their own devices. The generals had interests in so many colonial assets that the troops could no longer move freely. So De Lugo made a decision. If your wineskin is old, the only thing to do is get a new one. Sorry, are you all opposed? And besides, once an order comes down, you don't get to oppose it. Where do you guys get the nerve to resist? He had been thinking it for some time, but kept talking himself down until today. Yes, it's vital that we defend key locations. We can't agree to this sort of operation. The colonial generals were completely caught up in their own interests. Really, he would like to have the military police expose them, even personally, but a war was on and the enemy was right up ahead. His top priority was to cut inept generals from the chain of command. Under the circumstances, he didn't even care if that meant some golden parachutes. Of course, once he resolved to carry out a reshuffle, he prepared carefully. The units they commanded were already under his control de facto. He had nipped in the bud the possibility of a military resistance. The NCOs and lower-ranking commissioned officers were the first he turned. Now he simply had to replace the command structure of the gathered colonial army. Regardless of the generals, there were actually lots of great non-commissioned officers and soldiers of lower rank in the colonies. Colonial service was a 1 to 2 year rotation, and the fact that he could expect most of them to follow orders from Central was no small boon. Additionally, De Lugo had a tight hold on the reins to the escaped units. Now that he was sure he could do the reshuffle and unify the command chain, there was no reason to hesitate any longer. All I need to do is dismiss these guys. Keeping his voice matter-of-fact, De Lugo proceeded with the plan he envisioned. I believe I've grasped the situation. If you're that strongly against it, then I have no choice. General De Lugo, do you mean to say that you understand? Yes, it's too bad, but it would probably be difficult to command in an operation you so oppose. I would never want to pressure you to do such a thing. Things would end quickly. By the time most generals realized something was up, he had to be ready. Which is why De Lugo then played his trump card, control over personnel. I've found other more suitable positions for all of you. You can go as you are, so please serve in the government office as councillors. Councillor in the colonial government on the southern continent was, frankly, a sinecure to warm up the window seats at the government office. It was usually given to people missing in action until they were found, unless they were declared dead. It was a clear statement that your presence or lack thereof didn't matter. To put it another way, it was an appointment that assumed your absence. Of course, that meant it completely removed all your real power, which was only natural since it was a post a person missing in action was meant to fill. No one expects someone MIA to get any work done. General DeLugo. The generals kicked up a fuss once they finally realized what was happening, but DeLugo had zero intention of lending them an ear. He already had written appointments for all of them. The vital mid-ranking officers in control of the units in the field were all backing him. He had exercised his power over personnel and forced through the reshuffle precisely because he could solve the problem without it evolving into an obnoxious fight. Your orders have been arranged. Now then, if you'll excuse me, I have an operation to lead. It may not mean much, but I hope you find success in your new endeavors. Leaving them with that in a voice that said the decision was final, he stood roughly and laid a hand on the door to leave. With no mind to listen to the jumble of distressed shouts behind him, he felt refreshed. I sure told them. He wouldn't let them wreak havoc in the army anymore. No, he wouldn't let anyone get in his way. After leaving the former commanders in their uproar, DeLugo proceeded straight to another room where others were on standby. Gentlemen, sorry to keep you waiting. Let's get this operation going. It was the combat commanders who stood and saluted him. The ones from home plus the ones from the colonies made up his staff. This was the entirety of the Republican Army, the Free Republican Army. In order to carry out organized combat, they chose DeLugo, and he knew that was why he was able to unify the command chain so rapidly. Okay, what's our status? It may have been cornered, but the Republic still just barely counted as a major power. Trying to make a comeback in the colonies, it had more than a little talent in its ranks. In its staff, in its general, and in its seasoned soldiers, it had retained the framework of an army. Its officers with combat experience could hold their own when it came to analyzing the necessary data and planning operations. It wouldn't be at all difficult to slaughter the Empire's 2 divisions if they clashed properly. And DeLugo knew how important it was to think of a plan for clashing in that way. The enemy General Rommel had taken out the Commonwealth forces in surprisingly mobile battles before they could even assemble, so there was a common understanding that a decentralized advance to engage would be reckless. And since logistically it was hard to move a concentrated army in the desert, supplies were also a major limiting factor. The problem of where to get water could never be ignored when moving a large army around. Water had to be prioritized over everything else in the desert. Running short even once could turn into a supply crisis. Soldiers without oil simply have to walk, but soldiers without water die of thirst. The Imperial forces, on the other hand, only one corpse could probably advance altogether. They did have to deal with the water issue, but since they had fewer people, it made things easier. Surely that had to be the case. Naturally, DeLugo could expect that if they advanced separately, the Imperial troops would destroy them all. Everything's going according to plan. The Imperial army is on the move. That was why he had made so much noise about retaking their lost land. He had serious doubts whether those generals could maintain confidentiality, so he had emphasized it. To create the illusion they were making that move, he gathered a lot of supplies and simultaneously took a look at the various routes. The Imperial forces were far from incompetent. Surely, they understood the Republicans wanted to capture their base. According to intelligence DeLugo had received via the Commonwealth, they were already building defensive lines in Toulouse. The status showed that the enemy thought exactly what DeLugo wanted them to think. Well then, but he grinned. Every person present responded with a scheming look. This situation was exactly what they were gunning for. General von Rommel was exceptional. Any officer who saw his war records would admit it. He was the top authority on maneuver warfare of his generation, and DeLugo praised him for it despite being his enemy. After all, everyone understood the difficulties involved in a mobile battle in the desert. How hard it would be to pull off a timely split-up advance in the sand where you were liable to lose track of your own position. Just his ability to quickly move troops in an organized way through the desert was worthy of admiration. That said so much for his organizational efficiency, it made De Lugo sick. If their opponent was this militarily adept, wrangling with them head-on was too much of a risk. Naturally, the enemy general would understand that though the city was at the mouth of a bay, it would be impossible to defend if surrounded. But even a child would know not to take on all the Republican troops on the southern continent with a single corps. In other words, it would be simple for anyone to recognize the need to resolve this situation. They could probably also recognize that the competent soldiers of the imperial military would have some ideas about how to do that, if not many. For instance, withdrawal. If the enemy didn't feel the need to defend the base to their deaths, they could retreat to ill-known territory. But De Lugo smiled inwardly. The imperial army didn't have any choices. As an expeditionary force, even if they wanted to retreat, they would absolutely need to secure port facilities. And the only port facilities they could use at the time were those in Toulouse. They did still have the option of retreating to the kingdom of Ildoa, but it was probably safe to consider that one politically unacceptable. In that case, anyone could understand the conclusion that striking units before they concentrated was the only move the imperial army could make. It was a textbook scenario, and for that reason, De Lugo could also guess how the imperial officers would handle it. They would take all the fighting power they could and secure local numerical superiority to strike the Republican units that were probably advancing separately. With that, they would achieve a mobile defense. That had to be the best answer available to Rommel, since he knew that De Lugo had no need to send his individual units out to get destroyed. On the contrary, he would lure the enemy out of their nest, overwhelm them with a large force and crush them. Yes, the report is that they've sortied, and the notification he was waiting for had already come in. The Commonwealth intelligence had volunteered to do recon, and they had a handle on the situation in Toulouse. The Imperial Army has left Toulouse. They received the report in almost real time. At that point, the Imperial Army was doing just what the Free Republican Army wanted it to. They think they are going to surprise us and attack while we're advancing all split up. It's a truly by-the-book method of coping with this situation. We've cornered them so badly, they have no other options left. All we have to do now is destroy them. Now there will have been a point to fighting these dopes. In order to lure them out, the Republicans had intentionally leaked their strategic objectives all over the place. They even performed highway maintenance to throw their enemy off track. Well, actually, De Lugo had the field engineers devoted to building a minefield, so the infantry were the ones working on the highway, but still. At any rate, their deception was paying off. The Empire has crawled out of its nest. All we have to do now is hit them while they are blithely on their way to carry out their sneak attack. For a short distance, the supply lines will manage even if we concentrate our forces. Even if the Imperial forces notice us concentrating and retreat, I don't mind one bit. At that point, the Republicans could carry out their decentralized advance unobstructed. All right, gentlemen, let's get ready. Finally, it was how they all felt. Finally, we can strike back at the Empire. They were elated. The Imperial forces intended to take them by surprise, so they prioritized speed over enemy spotting as they approached. The plan was to draw them into a minefield and hit them with a fierce attack. The Imperial forces may be elite, but we'll catch them in a crossfire from our light, quick units and thoroughly obliterate them with our heavy units. That was how everyone felt as they formed up. Now the day to achieve those results had come. In terms of numbers, the Republicans were sure they had the upper hand, and when they fought them head-on, they wouldn't necessarily be inferior then either. Sure, their opponents were seasoned old-timers, but in this instance numbers meant everything. Technically, they were both major powers. If one side overwhelmed the other with numbers, the winner would be decided. We strike back. Yes, sir, and so Republican morale was high. They were about to launch into their long-awaited counterattack. We're gonna scare the living daylights out of the empire. October 6, Unified Year 1925, Tiru's naval base outskirts. Good grief, at this rate, I'm not going to even have any tea for tea time. After somehow managing to escape the blazing Tiru's naval base, trading with the nomadic tribes had been going brilliantly. He thought he was getting along with them pretty well. The intelligence exchange was actually worthwhile, too. It was with the nomads' help that he had been able to observe Tiru's naval base and get a handle on the Imperial Army's movements. But John did have one irresolvable complaint about his work right now. An absence of tea, which was a life-or-death matter for a civilized gentleman. The nomads enjoyed their own infusions, but it wasn't the tea John loved. And when he tried, with no expectations, to request some from the home country, they heartlessly told him to procure it on the ground. Humans are weak creatures and hope even when they know things won't turn out, so the indifferent response upset him. Thus the man recalled his home country's cold response and lamented dramatically. Well, there was the fact that John was in the desert and clad in the local costume too. He led a caravan, mingling with the nomads, clumping along atop a camel. He fit right in, and at a glance you wouldn't even notice him. He was lucky he had managed to take on some officers who were familiar with the desert to some degree. Well, that was a silver lining anyway. They would be able to keep doing business with some of the tribes, which would allow them to keep their intelligence net up. His message had reached the Republican side fine, so John could finally take a break. Whatever else happens, it seems like the reconnaissance will work out. Things were so calm he found time to complain. One could say his situation wasn't too shabby. Dear guest, you will keep our terms, yes. Of course, you have my word. I've got more confidential funds than I know what to do with. But a gentleman through and through, John lamented, even though I'm sorely lacking tea, they say to rejoice that I have money. He wasn't so lacking in elegance or John Bull's spirit that he could be happy about that. Sometimes he sadly wondered if the twits in Whitehall were too tainted by the ideas of the city. It really made him want to cry. Would that bunch in Whitehall honestly tell me to drink money instead of tea? He really wanted them to send him some or do something at least. He was of a mind to demand more attention to the welfare of agents working abroad. They don't understand the suffering people go through one whit. Those pseudo-gentlemen who knew nothing about actual working conditions were such a pain. But that was precisely why he needed to focus on the job before him, so he brought his attention back to the present. So that's the situation. I'd like it if we could keep a good relationship. John had plenty of opinions, but he was an outstanding agent. He was maintaining observation and communication nets using the nomadic tribes. At the same time, he was providing weapons to some of them to support guerrilla activity. He had also contracted to receive any imperial prisoners they took, and made an agreement for Commonwealth prisoners as well. At any rate, John had built the network necessary to confront the Empire. It went without saying that it was an extraordinary amount of work. John feigned calm atop the one-humped camel. He had made it through countless tricky situations. Once he even got caught up in a nomad conflict and roused his old bones to take up a rifle. John was a fine fox hunter, but he had had enough of the camel-mounted cavalry attacker so much so that if he had a chance, he wanted to bring a submachine gun, or actually the new model of the Imperial-made assault rifles would be good. The supplies we get from you help us too. This was one of the tribe's chiefs. About their dealings, he was positive. He welcomed the opportunity to acquire live ammunition to unify the tribes in the area. After all, since heavy arms, explosives and the like were mainly acquired from abroad, securing a stable way to get them before the other tribes was a big deal. But unlike John, they hadn't sworn alliance to any nation. But if you want to see what we can do, shouldn't you be sending in soldiers too? Which meant they often offered terms that people like John could never swallow. The relationship between the nomad tribes and the Commonwealth had to be kept secret. If word got out that he was embedded in a tribe, he wouldn't be able to infiltrate places as part of their caravans like he did now. More than anything, Clandestine activities had to be kept clandestine. For example, he absolutely couldn't leave any record that he was working with the tribes behind the scenes in ways that could lead to an anti-republic war in the Republican colonies. John's hardship would continue, so he made a wish. Please let the Free Republican Army do their job properly. October 12, Unified Year 1925, Imperial Army Camp. General von Rommel, I'd like to make a suggestion. Even when the veil of night is about to fall, breaks are an unattainable luxury for members of the Imperial Army General Staff. The Air Fleet has turned in their final reconnaissance reports for the day, but the work of analysing them with insufficient lighting and equipment awaits the staffers on the ground. Still, just as everyone is thinking it will be a quiet night, Major von de Guritschaf shows up, and the first thing out of her mouth is that she has a suggestion to make. Naturally, it's especially surprising that a field officer would come to offer opinions at this time of day. What could it be, they wonder? That said, almost no one finds it suspicious. De Guritschaf's tone is not tense at all but utterly businesslike. And it's not so uncommon for someone to suggest something to the commander. Well, the time of day is somewhat odd, but it fits with the Imperial Army tradition of taking action. So there are no reproachful glares saying, "How rude." But it is strange enough that almost everyone looks over in spite of themselves out of curiosity. What in the world is this field officer worried about? To Tanya, though, that right there is what she wants to bring up. The indecisive gazes of the officers and their hesitation is exactly what makes her anxious. In this situation, under these circumstances, the faces of the staffers don't seem worried at all. She has to say something. What is it? Well, it's wonderful to have a boss who will at least listen to you. A boss who increases incentives for his subordinates creates the best military environment. It's so much easier to work with someone like this. Tanya's mood lightens as she senses that they will be able to get along and respect each other's interests. That's why she feels that they should step in to cover for each other if necessary. I'd like permission to scout ahead of the main forces. Naturally, it's a plan that serves both of their interests, although it conceals her true intentions. Tanya doesn't want to do anything dangerous, hence her desire to move cautiously. The military would be in trouble if there was a miscalculation, right? And if that happened, the mages, by their nature, are the branch that would be worked extra hard doing recon in force and pursuit battles, essentially extinguishing the fire when it broke out. Tanya is not the type to spare efforts now if she can reduce risk in the future. That could reveal our sneak attack plan. What's your intent? I believe our knowledge of enemy movements is insufficient. Naturally, her outward expression of these sentiments is fully armed with logic. Armies are rational to a point. Oftentimes they don't make sense, but they can't ignore reason completely. That's only natural, arguing some theory that bends physical laws won't help them defeat their enemies. We've sent out reconnaissance units, though. We're currently dependent on the Air Force units in Toulouse. Tanya understands their current dilemma, how difficult it is to perform recon while advancing, so she drives her point home before he can tell her that's why they're relying on the Air Force. And we knew this, but Air Force units are limited by their navigation apparatus capabilities. It's difficult for them to perform night reconnaissance. True, at a glance, it makes sense to send the Air Force to scout ahead of the advancing ground army. Certainly, it would be nearly impossible for the average foot soldier to scout ahead in a desert with no landmarks. On that point, a reconnaissance aircraft, endowed with a navigation machine, does have the advantage. But at night, aircraft run into a lot of problems. Aerial photography capabilities are extremely limited at night, and it's not uncommon to simply not be able to get any. Of course, she knows that General von Rommel and the staffers are doing their very best. The army is focusing on advancing quickly and efficiently in order to strike the enemy forces before they can concentrate. Due to time limitations, they haven't done anywhere near enough recon. The Imperial military isn't stupid enough to not worry about that, which is why aircraft were arranged. and they are handling the situation with cooperative efforts between the air and the ground. That's an important, respectable achievement, and Tanya acknowledges that. Still, no matter how great their efforts, there are too many technical limitations for aircraft to do reconnaissance of the ground at night. And the chance for accidents would be too great if they sent them up anyway. They can't ignore the risk that the enemy could get a clue about their movements from a crashed plane. And even without that, our intel is incomplete. Disregarding those issues, Tanya is forced to point out, per her obligations as an officer, that the trickier problem is their limited field of vision. Air units have conducted reconnaissance of the vicinity, but the problems with that are fuel and territory under enemy air forces. No matter how faithfully, no matter how earnestly they carry out their missions, there are still limitations, right? It has to be said. And the Air Force reports they've gone to such lengths to get only one side of the situation. As a staffer, too, she has to point out that if they rely on the air too much, they run the risk of biased data or outright misunderstandings. Given these concerns, I firmly believe we should take precautions. In short, even if it's only her outward-facing argument, those issues can't be ignored so easily, and her suggestion is in the commander's interest as well. Tanya is proud she can offer a win-win proposal. All right, permission granted, you have my gratitude. I'll take my battalion out immediately. She thanks him and exits the tent. She promptly calls up her battalion. Since First Lieutenant Weiss was on standby for rapid response, he answers in one ring. Splendid. Satisfied with his performance, she alerts him they will be sortying. After additionally ordering careful preparations, she races across the sand back to her own tent. Long-range night reconnaissance, and in a desert to boot. They need to double-check their navigation instruments. They have to be ready for the possibility of a sandstorm cutting off communications. They make all the preparations a unit operating solo can in the unique climate and environment of a desert. Upon reaching her tent, Tanya takes a look at the navigation chart with the help of her adjutant, Second Lieutenant Serebriakov, and consults with Weiss to plan where they should search for the enemy. Considering the possibility of unforeseen encounters with recon forces, they split into companies. A total of 4 companies will fan out to form a line, and after searching, they will return to a designated meeting point. An orthodox method, but given the situation, it should be useful. In order to resist the Republican forces during their decentralized advance, locating them is essential. If she locates the enemy ahead of time under the pretext of officer reconnaissance, she decreases their risk of an encounter battle. She's definitely not opposed to doing work behind the scenes to minimize danger in advance. It pleases her to do a reliable, thorough job. More than anything, she stifles a laugh, thinking back at how hard they got worked on the Rhine front. I'm just glad it's not recon in force. Recon in force meant they had to go forward while getting shot at, whereas regular reconnaissance means all they have to do is bring back intelligence. Even if they have to be prepared to get shot at, it's a lot more relaxing to fly when that isn't the assumption. Of course, she hasn't forgotten that they are on a battlefield where all risks apply. In a recon mission, there's always the danger that the enemy will pursue, and she understands that. But right now, they haven't received any reports of enemy contact in the entire area. In that case, this should be a pretty enjoyable flight, and there's also the option of discovering and striking small command posts. Being safe is unconditionally wonderful, and getting results while safe is even more wonderful. The other important point is that in the opposite situation, that is, if risks suddenly escalate past a tolerable level, all the battalion needs to do is turn around and break away. Thus, that night, Tanya ascends into the sky in a relatively relaxed state of mind. Of course, even a desert gets terribly cold in the dark, but it's quiet and calm, so the journey is a leisurely night flight. As someone with experience on the Rhine lines and in the north, and given the lack of nighttime scrambles and large-scale enemy units coming to attack, she finds the job a simple matter of flying through the tranquil sky. That said, while at first she is glad for a smooth flight, as time goes on and they get farther out, a sense of unease gradually begins to grate on her. It's too quiet. We could come into contact with an enemy patrol or commando units any time now. Keep an extra sharp watch on the ground. Yes, ma'am. All units, keep your guard up against the sky and the ground alike. We're already close to the projected enemy location. Look out for patrols or commandos. Pay special attention to the dunes. Don't miss any light sources. It's entirely possible that the enemy is alert to the possibility of a search. Conducting a decentralized advance in secret is a logical move. That means we have to be extra thorough. But we fly and meet no enemy. No matter how far we go, we don't even spot any other life forms besides us, much less the enemy. Fairy 01 to Fairy Battalion members. Normally an empty battlefield is a welcome state of affairs. There aren't very many people who want to cause trouble for themselves, so normally we should be happy the enemy is nowhere to be found. Still, there are a number, albeit a small number, of significant exceptions. For example, it's no good if there is nothing in a space or territory where there is supposed to be something. That's not nothing here, but something missing. Commanders report in. Company 2 no contact, we haven't spotted anything. Company 3 nothing besides us out here. Company 4 contact negative. So the lack of an expected occurrence is a sign of a gravely worrisome situation. That's weird, this is a bit absurd, the enemy isn't here. They are supposed to be here, but they are not. If they were missing from one position, that would be one thing, but if they are missing from every position, you start to feel like you're chasing phantoms. It's as if their decentralized advance is a sandy illusion. An illusion, that's a hypothesis. But what if that hypothesis is reality? The plan is to take out each individual group of enemies approaching in a decentralized way. I see. They'll be too much to handle if they are concentrated, but if they are split into 3, we're able to overwhelm them both quantitatively and qualitatively. So General von Rommel didn't make a mistake in having us go out to destroy them before they are able to surround Tiru's naval base. At least not if the enemy is actually conducting a decentralized advance. But they must not be. Our intention was to attack the split-up enemy before they concentrated, but the way things are going, there's a good chance they are actually concentrated now. They could even already be in battle formation. Now then, our HQ still hasn't been able to locate them. If under these circumstances we get attacked by an enemy force twice our size, what will happen? Clearly, we'll end up on the bad side of Lanchester's law. If the enemy is divided, we can win, but if they are concentrated, we won't be able to handle them. Connect me to HQ. It's urgent, hurry, it's an emergency. We thought we would make fun of them for advancing split up. Instead, they got us. No, perhaps the Imperial Army was arrogant. Full of regret, she raises her voice. The Imperial Army was too conceited. How could we underestimate the enemy's intelligence? What an error. The mistake of following precedent because we stopped thinking indicates inflexible reasoning and a lack of innovation. When we deployed to the south, we thought about facing a colonial army in an unconsciously biased way, and it's taking its toll. This is a trap. This has to be a trap laid by the Republican Army. They tricked us. The enemy isn't here. Where are they? That's obvious. They must have fulfilled the rule of force concentration. They made efficient uses of the resources they had. They are probably sneering at our naive predictions this very minute, because the concentrated enemy forces are surely committed to the main battlefield. Battalion commander to all companies. As of this moment, abort your missions. Gather up immediately. I say again, gather up immediately. As a commander engaged in a reconnaissance mission, Tanya knows exactly what this means. That's why she gave the order to contact headquarters right away. You haven't got an HQ yet, but the apparatus picks up noise. The area around their headquarters is already under heavy jamming, so their signals are blocked. But just barely. They just barely manage to get a spotty connection. Tanya orders Serebriakov to explain the situation and tries to come up with countermeasures. What are we going to do now? The problem is how to take care of things. Reality is that the enemy field army is gathered together. We can't expect interdiction missions like obstructing traffic or severing their supply lines to take effect before the forces attack. And if their forces are concentrated, a simple comparison of fighting power shows we're overwhelmed. Considering the progress of the battle, our options for supporting the main forces are limited too. After all, our corps have already advanced, lured by the honey of destroying the divided enemy troops. Armies can't stop very easily once they've started. Even if HQ decided to retreat, the enemy wouldn't let that stop them. They'd follow close in pursuit. If that happened, the communication lines would be severed before the main Imperial forces could even build resistance lines, and the Southern Front would go down in history as a major defeat. Even if they retreat to Chiru's naval base without command of the sea, it will only be a matter of time before they have to surrender. Now, the important thing here is how I can run away without harming my military record. Beneath her disgruntled face, Major Tanya von de Guritschaf is deep in thought. If she doesn't want the Imperial army to lose, she can't deny the possibility of going back to support the others. So for a moment, she seriously considers the idea, but she concludes it's impossible. At this point, an Imperial victory is out of the question. We're up against an overwhelmingly superior foe. If we can't take them out, there's no chance of winning. And considering we're in a desert, the option of holing up in the temporary defensive position set up by the field engineer team and waiting for the situation to change is hopeless. In a desert, water is precious, probably as precious as gasoline. Maybe if we were near a water source it would be different, but at any other position in the field, a couple days' siege is enough to have us writhing in thirst. So defending a fixed point where there is no water is too dangerous. Water, water. Without water, we can't fight a war. Shit. This is why I hate the desert, Tanya gripes, but she doesn't stop thinking. Currently, it's impossible for the Imperial army to face a large force in the desert. They don't have enough water. But if they retreat, the enemy will follow them forever. Even if they confront them, if they can't defeat them all, they'll run out of water and die of dehydration. It'd be a terrible irony to suffer from thirst at Chiru's naval base with a view of the sea. No thanks. Under the circumstances, the measure they could take to contribute to an Imperial victory might as well be going and dying in a fight against the huge enemy army. No way am I taking any suicidal missions like that. All right, in this case the only thing to do is strike the enemy's water. So Tanya narrows down her choices to the realistic supporting move of striking the enemy's supply lines. After all, there has to be some kind of military support, or all their friendly troops will be wiped out, and this should protect her military career as well. But she suddenly regrets this idea. Her battalion can take pride in being one of the best, but it's still just a single aerial mage battalion. Regardless of their abilities, they will be hopelessly outnumbered. Even if they were going to support the troops' withdrawal, it would be practically impossible by orthodox methods, and even the long-range penetration in de facto enemy airspace to strike their water transport lines is just unreasonable. And in terms of securing their own water too, the Imperial maps had almost no information about nearby oases. Should we bank on friendly contact with local nomads? If it doesn't work out, it'll be the ones suffering from thirst. I'm definitely not interested in that either. Think what is the enemy's logic? The enemy thinks they've tricked us, so what's the next logical step? In short, the Republic army feigning a decentralized advance thinks the Imperial troops are concentrated. Oh, no, that's it, I see. The main forces certainly are concentrated, so how about we use their logic against them? As she mumbles, she continues her train of thought. And what if the enemy falls into the same bias that the Imperial army was trapped in until moments ago? They think they have all our units pinned down. Naturally, she can expect that under that assumption, the enemy won't be paying much attention to the possibility of a powerful combat unit coming at them from behind. In a sense, it's a prospect stemming from a wish. But in this situation, her human psyche gives her hope. Good, she crows, But even if that hypothesis is true, she is still distressed about what her role will be. Certainly, it might be possible to cause some temporary confusion by jabbing them in the back, but can the battalion maintain that confusion? Not sure. Even if they can create a break in the encirclement, God only knows if they can keep it open. In other words, you can put as much faith in that plan as you can in that bastard being X. Actually, the more she thinks about it, the more dangerous it sounds. If they do manage to punch a hole, the army will no doubt order them to hold their ground to keep it open even an instant longer. Maybe I should just run away, but there's definitely a court-martial waiting for her if she does that. Fleeing before the enemy and on top of that, abandoning the troops to do so, she's sure no one would protect her like they did when she screwed up off the coast of Norden. In that case, her fate would be getting sent to a silent firing squad, getting shot after being repatriated and court-martialed, or if she was lucky, a messenger would deliver a pistol and tell her to commit suicide. Not many options. There aren't many ways to explain away fleeing before the enemy. No, you can try to gloss it over, but for better or worse, a soldier is expected to fight bravely. Anyone who takes a hike when their allies are in a crisis is just like unlucky Admiral Byng. No officer wants the same fate as Admiral Byng, who failed to do his utmost. Tanya has seen with her own eyes that there are officers in the field who would rather fight a reckless battle. Of course, she never dreamed she would be in this position herself. If she had official orders to leave, that would be a different story, but since it's common military sense in the present situation to rescue the main forces, surely General von Rommel would give such an order. That fact can't be ignored, so then I should fight under the given conditions. All I can do is fight and find a way out of this up ahead. My top priorities are survival and self-preservation. Therefore, it's essential that I don't appear to have abandoned my fellow troops, so if possible, I'd like one result of my actions to be that they take as little damage as possible. Still, only as little as possible. If I can prove they took less damage because of me, then the reality that I helped save them will lessen the criticism I receive over my lack of motivation. Okay, so how can I uphold my reputation while minimizing damage to the troops and also escaping to live another day? Looking back through history, you see there is nothing more horrible than a fighting retreat. And in that case, even if you managed to survive, you didn't really defend what you were supposed to. Under the circumstances, it's too risky to ask the heavily encircled main forces to withdraw with minimal casualties. But there are examples in history where both conditions were met. For example, the Battle of Sekigahara. The results of the clash between Eastern and Western armies are famous, right? Betrayal, conspiracy, hesitation. In any case, there's a lot to learn there. The final days of the defeated army were utterly miserable. Most of their territory was either seized or the meager kokudaka from its rice yield was gobbled up. In the first place, many of them failed to leave the battlefield, but there was a nearly crazy bunch who, despite participating in the battle, not only managed to get their general out but also showed off their martial zeal. Their name, the Oni Shimazu, the Shimazu clan. In other words, the logic is that if we ram through the enemy and then leave, we're not fleeing before the enemy. No, but Tanya feels somewhat conflicted. Let's be honest. She mentally complains that breaking through the enemy and making it back is mission impossible. I'm not sure if the guys who can casually pull feats that warrant special mention in Historiethink Kellerman's charges are sane. This is a difficult era for a sensible person like me, but if I must, if I have no choice, that's my duty. Early in the morning, October 13, Unified Year 1925, Republican Army Camp. It seems we've won. Yes, General. The scene before their eyes was the Republic's revenge on the Empire, something that most Republican soldiers had been dreaming of since the collapse of the Rhine front. He had lured the enemy with false reports of a decentralized advance. Now he had them encircled with his concentrated forces and was about to annihilate them. They were going to do to the Empire exactly what had been done to them on the Rhine front, and the resulting pride invigorated not only the staff but the troops as well. For General de Lugo, it was the first step in a counteroffensive for which he had prepared in every possible way. Of course, he was also relieved that the efforts he had put in so far were working. It had taken a long time, but if they could defeat the Imperial army here, they could reinforce their defense of the southern continent. They could take back Toulouse and turn it into a strong stepping stone for a counteroffensive on the continent. It was all finally within reach. Which was why the alarm going off grated so badly on his ears. Mayday from the 228th Mage Company. What is going on? That was basically the look on the radio operator's face as he delivered his report like a cry for help. The 12th Mage Battalion providing direct support for the right flank also requires urgent assistance. They say the enemy has almost broken through. The multiple dire reports from the right flank were added to the map with symbols showing the progress of the battle. Everyone looked at the new situation out of the corner of their eyes and fell silent. They knew it meant the mage units on the right flank were just barely holding out, but they all hesitated. They could hardly believe it. Emergency alert from Division 7 Command. What seems to be a regiment-sized unit of enemy mages is attacking the right flank. What? We didn't have them encircled. Finally, the division headquarters had reported in about the enemy movements. The staff officers would have preferred a calmer notification, but unfortunately such hopes were dashed. The hoarsely delivered report from a high-ranking frontline officer said that they were being attacked by a regiment of enemy mages. It was such awful news that de Lugo wanted to shout, "That's not funny." He thought he had them surrounded. Since the plan was to target the enemy flanks, the troops were trained specifically for counterland attacks. The job of stopping the pesky enemy mages was the mission of his own mages concentrated in the center. Each flank also had enough mages to stop a battalion's worth, just in case. But if their opponent had a regiment, that could mean that almost none of the Imperial mages on this battlefield had been surrounded. Of all the stupid, then who are the mages in the center fighting? But that's not consistent with the intel we have. De Lugo fell silent and stared at the map, their estimates of the enemy fighting force and the current actual scale of their mage units. There shouldn't have been such a severe discrepancy between them. It was true that his main mage force was engaged with what they believed was the main Imperial mage force. He had just received a report that due to their numerical superiority, they were maintaining the upper hand. So given the reports and the intel they had gotten ahead of time, there should be no way the enemy had mages to spare. But de Lugo pondered for just a moment. If it were possible. Well, it couldn't be. But do we only have numerical superiority because the enemy pulled a regiment of mages out of their forces? But that would mean they basically have a brigade's worth of mages in this battle. The possibility that our intel net missed that is greater than zero, but I'm confident in our grasp on enemy movement. The conclusion he had reached was that the Imperial army had a regiment at most. That should have been all the enemy had. It shouldn't have been possible for reserves to crawl out of the woodwork like this. Confirm if it's really a regiment. So the composed part of his mind doubted whether it was really a regiment. For example, maybe they were using some kind of deception to fool them into thinking the group was regiment-sized. Or the confusion could have caused a misunderstanding. But then what about all the reports from his units? He knew what they meant. Whether he could accept it or not was another problem. General de Lugo, we've already lost 2 companies. And most importantly, the dazed looks on the staffers' faces spoke volumes. De Lugo understood their disbelief and bewilderment quite well. The fact that 2 companies had been taken down meant that there was an enemy force out there big enough to overwhelm them in an instant. It would be different if they had put up resistance and been defeated. But if the enemy was stronger by the standard margin, the first message from a unit making contact would never be Mayday. If the 12th Battalion is about to be breached, the enemy force must be at least twice the size of that. And on top of that, there was the report like a shriek from the battalion assigned as direct support. If they were almost broken as well, the delaying defense along the entire right flank wasn't functioning as intended. Are you telling me there's an enemy mage unit so powerful we can't stop them even if we get support from the right flank division? NGH. Send the mages from the center over as backup. At this rate, they'll break the encirclement. De Lugo's brain had fallen into worry on this outrageous turn of events, but Colonel Vianto's shout rebooted it. Vianto had recovered fastest of all the momentarily paralyzed staff officers. Though they were behind, the others started to understand what needed to be done. If the batteries on the right flank were hit, there would be no way to stop the enemy from leaving, so the right flank needed reinforcements. It was an utterly sensible plan, but there was nothing sensible about their opponents. It happened the moment the unit was pulled and sent over. 5th Mage Battalion to HQ, the enemy mages are rapidly approaching. The warning scream was from the mage unit directly supporting not the right flank but the center. Ridiculous, Thayer not striking the batteries. He had just sent the 2nd Mage Battalion and the newly pulled 1st Composite Mage Regiment over to the right flank, but he was forced to realize with utter loathing that the enemy mages who had been running amok on the right flank had changed course. The maneuver wasn't even aiming to stop the reinforcements. For a moment, no one was sure where the enemy was headed. It wasn't a move to destroy the right flank's encirclement, which had seemed to be on its last legs. No, and it wasn't even a move to intercept the incoming backup. It was a charge at the Central Republican forces. Say, like devils, the truth came out of Vianto's mouth as a complaint. Vianto was more familiar with mages than anyone else present, and he understood the enemy's intentions. Or maybe it was more that he knew from experience what they would target next. Striking the right flank was just one of their objectives. If the Republican army had left them to their own devices, they would have broken through the right flank and left. But what do they do if the Republican army does the sensible thing and reinforces the right flank? Simple. They strike where units have just been removed, the center. It wasn't as if units would be taken from the left to go all the way on the right. To check enemy mages on the right, units would be taken from the center. Supposing the mages charged in a straight line, the noise and jamming would be such that their ability to detect enemies would be temporarily paralyzed. Then if the Imperial Army moves based on the sign of reinforcements on the way, that moment Vianto instinctively understood the horrible truth, and his spine froze. The mages were finally protecting the right flank. The exact instant they finished fanning out, they became useless. They couldn't contribute a single thing at the decisive moment the center was being attacked. No, we made them useless. The enemy maneuvers appeared to be the meanderings of a cornered group, but in fact they were more devilish than the devil, using tactics that were the height of cunning and extremely devious. The enemy mages were pulling off maneuvers Vianto wasn't even sure were theoretically possible. He thought he was well versed in the terrors of the Imperial mages. General De Lugo, please fall back. What? The enemy is coming here, damn it. They mean to recreate what they did on the Rhine front. They would take out the headquarters with a surgical strike. Anyone would laugh it off as a bad dream, but the Empire executed it on the Rhine lines. They broke through the Republican main lines, positions built to have incomparably tight defenses, and took out the fortress-like headquarters. The panic that overtook the frontline units at the time was on a practically indescribable scale, and the current Republican army didn't have a substitute for De Lugo. It had just exchanged its old wineskin for a new one. It didn't have another ready. The Free Republican Army, as one could tell just from the name, had taken enormous efforts to achieve. So if the general at the head of the Republic fell now, of all times, continuing an organized resistance would be nearly impossible. To the Imperial Army, even if its entire Southern Expeditionary Corps got wiped out, if they managed to take De Lugo with them, it would still be a victory. No, it'll be hard to take out the Imperial Army now. They'll probably just get a little beat up. And what will happen to our firepower and units if we send them out to face those mages? At the very least, we won't achieve our initial objectives. Men, protect the general. This is our final battle. The enemy broke through on the Rhine, but here Vianto couldn't let it happen. He wouldn't give the Imperial Army another headquarters. The same day, Imperial Army camp. Ha 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 ha. Hearing that laugh, the unlucky non-commissioned officers who were also in the armoured vehicle grimaced. Well, anyone has the right to grimace if their high-ranking commander bursts out laughing when they are surrounded. If he's gone insane, this is going to suck. There was nothing terribly strange about their feelings. Normally, Rommel would have been considerate and held his laughter in. But for today he just laughed and laughed, more than you would think a person could. Ah, this is truly amusing. Way to go, Major. Just this once Rommel couldn't stop laughing. The scene before his eyes had made a tremendous impact that warranted the reaction. He thought he could control her somewhat on a leash, but actually she was much more effective when he let her go. She must have caught a whiff of something, that's why she wanted to go on recon so late. He was grateful that she had seen through the enemy ruse and alerted him the Republicans were on their way before the main forces encountered them. Thanks to that, he was able to prepare to face a superior enemy. At the same time, if there were units outside the encirclement, Yao'd think they would aim to withdraw. But he felt stupid about thinking that when he saw what was happening. Is she retreating forward? I have to laugh. Major von de Guritschaf's maneuvers are incredible. He had been puzzled when he heard the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion was engaging the enemy's right flank. How much will it really do when their encirclement is almost complete? At that moment, he had resigned himself to losing the entire army. He figured the 203rd Battalion's efforts would only lengthen the time it would take to wipe them out, and had even been considering ways to withdraw. If we do everything we can, maybe some units can escape. And if we're lucky, maybe we can sow the seeds of a defensive line reorg. So it took him a minute to understand that de Guritschaf had broken off combat and charged straight into the center of the enemy formations. He didn't realize it wasn't a charge of resignation and self-sacrifice until the confusion in the center of the Free Republican Army gradually spread and enemy movements grew sluggish. Directly after that, he finally got his answer as to her objective. Surprisingly, striking the right flank was a total diversion. Her real aim was the enemy's main force that he was facing with his troops, and her even bigger ulterior motive was to attack enemy command directly. That was her plan. She turned this fight around using maneuvers and securing local superiority. She was just like a magician. To an ally, she's surely an evil-crushing shield of white silver, but to headquarters, she's a mad dog indeed. Oh, she will achieve so much more off the leash. This had to be a headache for a proud general. A proud general wouldn't want to admit that someone of a lower rank, and a child at that, was better than them at war, but who would? Ah, so that's why most generals can't figure out what to do with her. No one likes a hunting dog who's smarter than the hunter. She's too talented to be a mere field officer. Any superior officer would have a hard time with her as a subordinate. She might even be too much for me to handle. I understand very well now why the General Staff, no, the Western Army Group, gave her the authority to act independently. She's a frightfully competent hunting dog. Thanks to her shaking off enemy reinforcements and ripping through their headquarters, the enemy was in a panic. The Imperial Army, supposedly surrounded by the remnants of the Republican Army, had managed to maintain an organized combat unit, and the situation was now such that it could make a breakthrough. They were free to push forward or retreat. And in fact, since the flanks couldn't do much due to the confusion in the center, they could even resurrect their initial plan to take them all out. We can do this. Rommel smiled ferociously. Hit the enemy's left flank. This is a mobile air battle. Hit their left flank and drive straight through their central forces. They would leave the disordered right flank alone for the moment. And the connecting unit in the center had fallen into disarray following de Guritschaf's attack. Rommel saw immediately that the left flank was what remained. Though it was currently isolated from its chain of command, the left flank actually had the most organized fighting power left. He would attack it with not a moment to lose. In order to do that, he needed all the military strength they had. What should I do? He started to wonder, but realized he didn't actually have enough troops to think that hard. The light division should defend our position. All the rest of you, get on the left flank, crush that left flank. Having decided to leave the greenest of his light divisions to hold down their position, he would take the rest of his forces to clash with the left flank in an attempt to bring down the encirclement and take out their enemies. If they did that, they would at least be able to secure a retreat. It would probably be possible to deal quite a blow if they hit them while they were already confused. That he had been able to make such a judgment so quickly was a testament to Rommel's unusual talent. At least maintaining an orderly resistance while encircled was praiseworthy. Once he had a course of action, he moved quickly. Tell the Major she can do whatever she wants. And then, no one knew if it was for better or worse, but he let go of the leash. The Chihuahua on the other end was probably cute and lovable, but on the battlefield he needed the wild hunting dog, and she could wreak way more havoc on the enemy if she and her battalion didn't conform to the norms. That was how it seemed to him, so he did it to reach his goals. Are you sure, sir? With that one, there's nothing better than to let her do her thing. Hunting should be left up to the hunting dog, right? When commanding a corps the same size as his enemies, Rommel himself had no intention of losing to anyone. He could probably even take on de Guerichat just fine. He was fairly confident of his ability to wage maneuver warfare on the operational level. But he understood that when it came to running a battalion, he was inferior. Or perhaps more importantly, he had to accept that he would never be as good as her at sensing the time to fight. The opportunity she seized with her brisk maneuvering was such a brief instant that though I could see it from afar, I couldn't grasp it. In any case, the more you try to control her, the more energy you waste. She and her battalion really are war's hunting dogs. They are cavalry officers of ancient times, the real deal. They know when, where, and how to go charging in. They could take prey without you teaching them how. So rather than risk them forgetting how by training them, it was much more logical to let them run wild. More importantly, hurry up and get ready for a penetrating raid. Get on the Republican guns before they regain discipline. He could think about how to use de Guerichat and the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion later on. Now it was most important to take care of the immediate situation. If we don't crush the Republican artillery, we'll be caught in a one-sided barrage. If I don't seize this chance, I'll be the most inept of the inepts. I have no interest in being mocked by history as an incompetent general who wasted the hard work of his fellow soldiers. Understood, right away. Praise be to the skirmishers and their crisp movements. Look how briskly they move, even under these trying circumstances. Those are veterans of the Rhine, all right. Even if their units are undermanned, they are more useful since they don't hesitate. A soldier who can move is better than one who can't. Once the light division acclimates, they'll be a bit more helpful. I'm glad they've at least been learning some fighting techniques. Gather all the remaining gunners together. I don't want to get caught round the back. As soon as you're done attacking the artillery, blast the hell out of the enemies in the center. No limit this time on the amount of shells you can use, just shoot like crazy. If we're trying to keep them in check, do we really need that many? We can't bring the artillery on the charge. Plus, the light division staying to hold our current position needs backup. Now get going. But surely they couldn't be expected to defend on their own. They were liable to collapse if he left them surrounded and alone. That would affect all the units charging too. Speed was paramount in a maneuver battle. In order to minimize the time the most vulnerable unit would be exposed, he'd have to make soldiers run. At that point, they really couldn't take the artillery with them. Then the only thing to do was have them put their firepower on display once they had taken up their position. Artillery employed in a practical way can be useful for both offense and defense, no doubt about it. Firing, distracting, defending, they do it all. If the troops left the guns as a trick up their sleeve, the defensive position could be defended while they fought the maneuver battle. There was hope. Yes, a path had opened. It's a race against time. Be quick, gentlemen, move out, put the armored unit out front. Sorry, sir, right away, sir. The existence of a light at the end of the tunnel reinvigorated HQ. It was a brilliant transformation, as if their monochrome world suddenly had color again. And he, Rommel, was no exception. Though they were surrounded, Rommel was in high spirits. Strangely enough, it seemed like things would work out somehow. With this operation and the tireless fighting of his subordinates, they would turn the tables, and the feeling was, man, this feels so great. If the gods exist, they sure work in mysterious ways. Ha ha ha, I can't make fun of the Major. It does feel good to turn the tables. All right, let's scare the living daylights out of M. Ha 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 ha, what a surprise. Ha 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 ha, indeed, at Republican headquarters. The normally tranquil, albeit stuffy room was wrapped in an unusual atmosphere. The tense staffers were watching the two high-ranking officers in the middle of the room who had big, empty grins on their faces. One was their commander, General DeLugo. The other was the officer regarded as the toughest, most experienced veteran of all of them, Colonel Vianto. Their most senior commander and the veteran they were supposed to be able to rely on burst out laughing. On a battlefield, there is no greater fear. When the two people who should have been their core cracked up instead of coping with the crisis, the staffers wondered, have they gone insane? With a shudder, and their faces all twitched. So for a short while the staffers were faced with the grave dilemma of whether or not to call a medical officer. Paying no mind to the confusion around them, DeLugo and Vianto continued to laugh. What's so funny? As some of the staffers watched very, very closely, they realized the laugh was almost their way of saying, who cares? And that they too had no choice but to follow suit. And after the laughter had run its course, they spat, this reality is a goddamn joke. That was their complaint against the absurd situation in which they found themselves. They had been completely confident that their battle formation would lead to victory. It was a simple operation that required only sticking to theory. Apply pressure on the surrounded Imperial Army from 3 directions. The Free Republican Army was structured in such a way that pre-battle forecasts indicated it could win against the Imperial Army. Was it had to be discussed in past tense? Did they seriously overturn our strategy with an operational level power move? They've got some balls. Now their plans had been completely obliterate Devon, though they hadn't made any mistakes on the strategic level. As a result of tactical maneuvers performed during operations, their strategic advantage was overcome. Theoretically, that shouldn't happen. But in reality, the situation they prepared for had been reversed. After attacking the right flank, the enemy regiment essentially traded places with the reinforcements to assault the central forces. The unit directly under Vianto was out intercepting, but surprisingly, the moment the enemies made contact, they began to retreat. Just like that, the Republicans couldn't stop them with their elite group, but neither could they organize a united resistance. If the enemy was coming at them on the offensive, some could pin them down and the main group could strike the rest of the Imperial forces, but if the enemy was retreating, they had to attack. Naturally, that made the logic work in reverse. Still, they couldn't just leave them be. They had to do something. But in their situation, they didn't have many options to choose from. The disorder on the right flank was unbearable, and the left flank was in a furious battle against the main enemy force attempting their breakthrough. When the battle was going in such a direction, they couldn't permit a regiment of majors to do as they pleased. And then, they could hardly believe it. The possibility had crossed everyone's mind, but they had dismissed it as unfeasible. The enemy majors have broken into multiple groups. Thathia pulling back around and fast. They were all suddenly speechless. Of all the, is that even possible? The scene was a vivid reminder of the gap in ability between the two sides. It's like they are playing tag with us. Just as the pair said, it happened the instant the intercepting unit hesitatingly gave pursuit. The Imperial forces smashed through as if they had been waiting for the slightest disruption in the lines. Since both sides were accelerating past each other, they should have been able to turn and fire, but they were going so fast it made combat difficult. Vianto's mages attacked anyway and barely grazed the enemy, but the Imperial mages nailed a handful of Republican mages. Arg send out the reserve unit, pincer the enemy with the intercepting unit. From a simple bird's-eye view of the shape of things, the charging Imperial forces were surrounded by several mages. At a glance, their encirclement and annihilation was only a matter of time. There were almost no gaps to escape through, and the Republican mage units were numerically superior as they closed in. But to someone actually in that fight, the situation looked totally different. The enemy ripped right through the surrounding mages. As if laughing at the Republicans' numerical advantage, the Imperial mages abruptly overwhelmed them with firepower and mobility. It was like a bad dream. Then, as if sneering at the Republic's attempt to suppress them, they made a crazy beeline for De Lugo's headquarters. "It's no good, they are too fast," someone cried. They were indeed too fast. Before the reserves could get in the air, before the pursuing unit could catch up, they had reached their target. They had charged all the way over there to eliminate a single person. But Vianto, at least, had been secretly preparing for this possibility. "I'm going to prevent a repeat of what happened on the Rhine front no matter what it takes. Hurry and get countermage defenses up. A direct hit is coming. Take shelter. HQ personnel, take shelter." Ignoring the uproar around them, Vianto started to shove De Lugo into a dugout, but when he sensed there wasn't enough time, he didn't hesitate. He promptly kicked De Lugo in and dove on top of him as a shield. The staffers who piled in immediately after him were lucky. Right as all of them knocked together in the dugout. "NGH." Someone shouted a warning in a quaking voice, and everyone went prone by conditioned response. The moment they instinctively, almost in a trance, ducked their heads, partially opened their mouths, and covered their ears, their eardrums endured a roaring blast. And what met their eyes when they looked up was the area HQ used to be, the aftermath of the mage's flyby. In addition to a smattering of anti-personnel explosion formulas, they had attacked with grenades and 50-kilo bombs. As those in the dugout looked on, the Imperial mages shook off the defending anti-air fire with ease and picked off pursuing Republican mages. The dogged pursuit continued, yet despite the strenuous efforts of the defending mages, the enemy broke free as the Republican leaders watched from the dugout. Most of the staffers were stupefied by that brief moment. The enemy attacked and left, and they hadn't been able to do a thing. So those are Imperial mages. Those are the guys who raged across the Rhine front. The shock was so much that the vast majority of the staffers had frozen, but Vianto, one of the few exceptions, began taking stock of the damage. The headquarters had taken direct hits with mage formulas and was destroyed. In that state, all its equipment had to be ruined. Their only choice was to use the backup command post. "I sure am glad we made a backup. Are you all right, General? By the protection of the Holy Mother. A little later and we would have been in trouble. I never thought the day would come I'd be glad to have a subordinate who would kick me without hesitating." Most importantly, the General was alive. Luckily, it should probably be said, De Lugo escaped with only bruises from when he dove, or rather was kicked into the dugout. No one blamed Vianto for them, though, because he had averted catastrophe. Still, even if their courage was feigned, they were calm enough to joke about it. Vianto determined they had dodged the worst-case scenario. He remembered the crisis of defeat. The shock at hearing their headquarters on the Rhine had been blown away. They couldn't let that happen again. Still, when he noticed De Lugo had his eyes squeezed shut like he was praying, he wasn't surprised, had been terrified himself. After all, the Republican army had nearly been decapitated again. On the Rhine, their response had been delayed because it was new to them, but this time they narrowly escaped making the same mistake. It was probably due to protection from God. He thought of the future of the fatherland, the pride of the Republic that would be passed on. Their determination to maintain that radiant glory, even if it was just an afterglow, was just barely getting them through this crisis. What's the damage? Things are a mess, but we can still manage to call it minimal. Shall we withdraw? They could still fight. At least they could still crush them in the next round. This was the southern continent, not the Empire's home base, but the territory of the Republic and the Commonwealth. Our odds in a long fight aren't bad. In that case, it's probably best to conserve our troops and go back to wearing down the enemy. With those thoughts, De Lugo decided to minimize their losses and withdraw. Yes, this time they lost. He felt that. They got us. But as a strategist, he had already accepted it and put it behind him. There's nothing we can do about this. We retreat. We retreat and watch for our chance to make a comeback. Notify all units to withdraw. Thea, absolutely not to chase any farther. We need to reposition ourselves. If a battle broke out, they wouldn't be able to win anyway, so the answer was to not fight. They would lure the enemy into a battle of attrition and grind them down. The fact that they had survived was already a turning point. He and the Republic would not lose. All they had to do was be standing on their 2 feet at the end of the war. In short, that was what victory was to the Republic. Ha ha ha, did you see them, Major? The looks on those numbskulls' faces. Ha ha ha, I understand how you feel, but you might want to watch what you say. In a truly rare occurrence, Major von de Guritschaf is in a good mood. She laughs gleefully from her belly, like a child of her age, as she leads the battalion. When Thea feeling good, even the most straight-laced person will crack a smile. Happily, the ability to feel genuinely joyful is the sign of a healthy mind, but they couldn't even provide you a proper escort. For how proud of their good taste they are, the escargots are awfully tactless. Thea just too slow, that can't be helped. Of the Imperial Army's officially adopted computation orbs, the Type 97 gets both superior altitude and speed. In fact, it leaves the others in the dust. 8,000 is considered the maximum combat altitude for existing orbs, but that's practical for the Type 97. It's such a high-performance orb that if you work extra hard, you can approach 12. Naturally, it's the optimal type for the self-preservation first tactic of hitting and running. With outstanding altitude, speed, and climb rate, the Alinium Type 97, known officially as an assault orb, boasts performance equal to its name. The Type 95 is a hugely flawed machine, but the Type 97, even Tanya is compelled to raise her hands to praise Alinium arms. She appreciates the safety and peace of mind the Type 97 gives so much that it's her trusty main orb. Although when she's really cornered, I have to ignore my myriad conflicts and tearfully relinquish that pillar of my being, the freedom of my mind. Life is really irreplaceable. That said, I don't have to face any extreme conflicts like that this time. You don't have to be Tanya to be happy about getting through something without having to make any tough decisions. Well, it's no wonder. Trends move fast in the Empire, especially if you're a Republican soldier holed up in the colonies. So even Tanya is in a jocular mood, though it's not in her character. It's so wonderful to be free of that curse that makes me sing songs praising God or whatever. In any case, let's drink to the Alinium Type 97. Now and then, Alinium Arms does a decent job. Hear, hear. Thanks to this thing, that duck hunt was a hell of a lot easier. If you focus on the outline, it looks like my battalion had a tough fight. We can even boast that we gave the enemy a good run for their money basically on our own. 1 battalion augmented, yes, but still 1 battalion punched through the encirclement, trapping friendly forces. With the enemy reinforcements at our mercy, we lured in the main forces and stopped them in their tracks. Then we turned back to attack and even did an anti-surface strike. If you add some rhetorical flourishes to our running around trying to escape and achieving 0 actual war gains, that is what you get. Someone from the Imperial Japanese Army might have said something like, "My spirited unit delivered a bold blow to the enemy's main forces unscathed, as was our mission, and now we're pulling back. I figured it would be bad to only avoid the enemy, so we did that anti-surface strike at the end in order to have some action to point top effect. Well, there were some newbie amateurs who seemed to think they were mages because they flew now and then, so I was able to rack up some points. Honestly, though, I'm not even sure if I should add them to my score. It's tricky because if you count little chicks only capable of flying, people think worse of you. The way the Empire assesses kills is quite strict, so even if you don't mean to pad your count, it's better to avoid anything that could look like you might be. Even if I hunted these guys by the dozens, talking big about that when they don't even compare to the enemies we faced on the Rhine will only make my colleagues ridicule me. I can't stand it when they say stuff like, "You want to brag about your hunting numbers that bad." If I count them, I'm sure people will be talking about my back. How desperate for kills can you get? But then Tanya has an idea. We'll have to mark down that this was a turkey shoot. Yeah, you're right, we can't make misleading reports. That's right. Didn't they say the same thing in World War Roman II? That a score against the Ruskies on the Eastern Front was totally different from a score against the American or British on the Western Front. This enemy sure is persistent, though. It seems they are still in pursuit. I don't want to mess up my record, she thinks, but when she turns around to look, the enemies seem raring to go. She thinks for a minute, but who knows what these creeps will do if she lets them follow her home. What a pain. What's more, it seems like the units coming after us know what they are doing. It's also aggravating that we can't shake them off even though we're nearing maximum acceleration. I would propose a law against stalkers, but such regulation wouldn't apply on a battlefield anyhow, so I guess you just have to save yourself. All right, let's play with them. Gentlemen at Surinobus, entertain our guests. I want to ambush these creeps so we can get away. We're already in Sudo Shimazu mode, so it's not a bad idea to take a page from their book here. They are the ones who are pursuing us. I would much prefer the civilized method of having a peaceful conversation. Tanya grumbles in her head. Once the enemy charges at you, you're left with no other option but to slaughter them, am I right? Yarog, let's give them an avalanche of cuddles. And her subordinate's response to her order is just as lively as she expected. The troops are thirsty for battle, which is great. That means she won't have any trouble getting volunteers to play the terribly difficult yet fun role of the bait, numbskull Imperial soldiers fleeing in a rout. Well, it just means they are the nasty type who like teasing puppies. Fairy 01 to 02 and 05. You guys are the bait, position yourselves in the rear. When those clowns attack, pretend to collapse into disarray and flee. First, she has 2 companies pretend to be the rear guard. The point is to get the enemy's attention. An enemy that is raring to fight is often like an enraged bull charging at a red cape. Her subordinates aren't red, but I've heard a bull will charge at anything waved in front of them. So to borrow from that example, they'll pretend they can't stand up to the enemy's attack and beat a disorderly retreat. She'll have 2 companies be the waving cape and get chased, while the other units pretend to flee before the enemy and get some distance. Feigning that they've lost the will to fight, they'll scatter to either side. Then all they have to do is wait at the optimal location and lure in those numbskulls who only know how to charge. The rest of you split up. After luring the enemy into airspace D3, we're going to attack from 3 sides. The moment the 2 bait companies lead the enemy into D3, the rest of the units, who were supposedly fleeing in chaos, will come back around and launch an attack. Then they'll all form a cone shape and cross their lines of fire, taking care not to hit one another. The moment that formation comes together, the enemy will be like a rat in a trap. Okay, gentlemen, time to give these goobs some learning. Tanya crows that they'll teach them that being surrounded is just as terrible in the sky as it is on the ground. Sadly, whether or not they'll be able to use what they learn is a matter for another dimension. And when the Imperial mages fire an improbable amount of formulas into that narrow airspace, the Republicans who so enthusiastically pursued them expire and fall one after the other. You don't have to be Tanya to recognize this as a morale-boosting, extremely smooth victory. Plus, Major Tanya von de Gurichaff gets to pad her score, and it doesn't even take that much effort. It's a wonderful job that results in easy, dramatic gains. Ha 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 ha, I can't stop laughing. Which is why, in a rare occurrence, she is able to be so cheerful she even cackles. She nearly says it would be great if it could stay this easy from now on, but she freezes when she realizes the implication of her words. Yes, the words from now on, from now on. This is what it means to be so happy you wrap back around to sad. Her thoughts stop for a moment, and then a terrifying premonition of the future sends chills down her spine. After regaining her composure, Tanya objectively recalls the situation she's in. Then, after thinking a moment, she shakes her head with an openly bitter expression on her face. Certainly we're winning easily at present. Even just now they've downed Republican majors like it was a turkey shoot, but war isn't usually like this. Having it this easy will ruin you. Taking out enemy rabble certainly makes for a straightforward victory, but it would be a mistake to expect all battles to be like this. Even before that, if we have such an advantage, shouldn't we be taking action to end the war? Tanya suddenly wonders why they are still fighting and groans unconsciously. Without even noticing First Lieutenant Weiss' questioning look, she sinks deep into thought as the unit returns to base. After mulling things over for a while, she is forced to acknowledge a shocking reality. When they land back at their desert base, she drops off her gear and dismisses the troops. Sipping a cup of cold water from the tank with an absent-minded expression, she looks out at the endless train of Imperial military vehicles coming and going across the desert. Supplies from the home country and transport trucks. All those things fight a desperate battle against the sand to assist in their victory. She isn't sure who came up with the idea, but they've wisely used camels instead of horses to carry some of the cargo, which probably increases efficiency. So their hard work is paying off. For now, things are fine. Their only enemies are the Republican remnants, who are hardly a formidable threat, and the Commonwealth's expeditionary forces. Regardless of numbers, the Imperial Army has them beat in terms of training, so any fight is a guaranteed turkey shoot. Conversely, though, we're wasting our vehicles on this pathetic enemy and putting serious strain on our supply lines. Certainly, in terms of General von Zettua's idea of a purely political deployment to put pressure on the Republic and expand our influence on the Kingdom of Ildoa, a southern continent expeditionary force is one answer. But that the words are on the tip of her tongue, but she can't get them out, and she sighs. Both Lieutenant General von Rudestorff's plan to wipe out the Republican army remnants and Lieutenant General von Zettua's political plan are choices that assume the number of major players in the war doesn't rise. They have made an expeditionary force a reality, using every means possible despite the trying situation in the rear and the limited forces they could muster. Tanya is compelled to worry. Considering the financial situation, perhaps this plan takes us too far out of our way on thin ice. There should have been any number of ways to go. The High Seas Fleet could have taken a make-or-break attitude toward taking command of the sea from the Commonwealth, even if both navies ended up destroyed. They could have established a puppet government in the Republic and made peace. But as far as Tanya can tell, the Imperial fleet is resorting to the fleet-in-being strategy of avoiding military risks and conserving its strength. While she can't deny that strategy has its logic, it's definitely not one that will defeat their enemies. Which is why she has ended up deployed to the inessential Republican colonies on the southern continent to pursue and destroy the remnants of the Republican army. Even discounting the diplomatic thoughtfulness vis the Kingdom of Ildoa, it's still putting the cart before the horse. The Empire might as well be idly radiating its superior fighting capabilities. In these separate small-scale battles, the Imperial generals won't lose. They are dominating on the tactical level. The General Staff is successfully managing mobility and deployment on the operational level, whether maneuver warfare or breaking through encirclements, as well as supply issues. Indeed, from a military standpoint, putting military and political pressure on the Republic remnants and the Commonwealth via the situation on the southern continent and planning to cooperate with Ildoa is not a grave error. But that's only from a purely military standpoint. Or Tanya has second thoughts and revises her conclusion. Maybe the General Staff is proposing policies from only a military standpoint from the start, and the rest they leave up to the government, not wanting to step on the administration's toes. But if that's the case, Tanya has to bury her head in her hands. What good will it do to expand the front any more than this? What does the empire possibly gain by taking former Republican colonies in a desert? Has the will to fight any enemy you find on the battlefield spread to the politicians in the rear, who are supposed to maintain their calm and think about strategy? As she follows this train of thought, she trembles at her horrible vision of the future. Then how? How are the politicians at home going to end the war? She murmured it to herself. But that one sentiment gives her a dreadful chill like a curse. Are the imperial politicians capable of ending the war? We, the Imperial Army, are winning in the field. We also have the initiative. That's why we're enjoying such good times right now. Yes, both politically and militarily this is our finest hour, so if this really is our finest hour then, what a waste, she laments. It's our finest hour, but the empire is still hemorrhaging its national power in a war that has no end in sight. November 1, Unified Year 1925, Commonwealth. House of Commons. Subjects of the Commonwealth, today I inform you that the day approaches when the Empire, that dreadful military nation, brings its power to bear on us. The voice of the Prime Minister speaking to all the Commonwealth's people over the radio conveyed their harsh reality. And unfortunately, I must also inform you that they mean to attack. But allow me to say this. I hope it will be of some small consolation that I promise you on behalf of the Commonwealth. It will be impossible for them to come by sea. Contrary to the content of his speech, however, his tone contained a hint of humour. But even our wooden walls, praised since long ago, would find the evil enemy we currently face a significant trial. War is no longer what it used to be, so he spoke, touching on the way war had changed. At this point we must frankly acknowledge without losing heart that we are entering a terrible age. Everyone listening carefully understood that he meant it would be a hard fight. This war will be harsh, and it will demand lengthy endurance. We will probably have to fight until either we or our enemy collapse. And it will be a fight that takes every last bit of strength our fatherland has. Along with his predictions, he made a declaration. But I promise my beloved fatherland. Each and every word was crystal clear. Someday we will destroy them. Someone in a pub shouted, "You bet we will," and multiple people nodded in agreement. But for now, I simply hope that in the Commonwealth of 1,000 years from today, our children's grandchildren will read in a history book written by one of us that now, this moment, was the best of times for the Empire. That was the history it was their duty to create. For us it is truly the worst of times, dismal it should be said. At the same time, for the Empire it is the best of times. He was even arrogantly confident that they would exist in perpetuity 1,000 years later. Now then, ladies and gentlemen, a toast to our worst of times. And don't we want our grandchildren to say it? Don't we want them to say these times were the Empire's best, to now, to our eternal fatherland's worst of time shears?